Deep beneath the sun-scorched limestone of the Giza Plateau, something waits, something that has waited for thousands of years. It is a structure that no one alive has ever entered, a chamber that no modern eye has ever seen, and yet the instruments of 21st century science tell us with absolute certainty that it is there. Right now, at this very moment, teams of archaeologists and physicists are probing the Earth with ground-scanning technology so advanced that it can peer through solid rock, and what they are finding is rewriting the earliest chapters of human civilization. But Giza is only the beginning. Across the globe, from the sealed tombs of ancient China to the forgotten fortresses of the Sinai Desert, from the sunken cities off the coast of Egypt to temples in southern India whose vaults have remained locked for centuries, discoveries are emerging that challenge everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. These are not myths, these are not legends. These are verified, documented, peer-reviewed findings that force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The past was far more sophisticated, far more interconnected, and far more mysterious than any textbook has ever admitted. This is the story of those discoveries. This is the story of what lies beneath. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. The Giza Plateau sprawls across approximately 2 square kilometers of desert on the western edge of modern Cairo, and it is, without exaggeration, the most studied archaeological site on the face of the earth. For more than 2 centuries, expeditions from every major university and museum in the world have combed its surface, cataloged its monuments, and published thousands of papers about its 3 great pyramids, the Sphinx, the causeways, the mortuary temples, the workers' villages, and the satellite tombs that cluster around the feet of these colossal structures. And yet, for all of that scrutiny, the plateau continues to yield surprises. It continues to guard secrets. It continues to confound. The most recent of these surprises emerged not from a dramatic excavation or a chance discovery by a wandering tourist, but from the quiet, methodical work of a Japanese-led research team using a technology called muon tomography. To understand what they found, one must first understand how muon tomography works, because it represents one of the most ingenious applications of particle physics to the study of the ancient world. Muons are subatomic particles created when cosmic rays collide with atoms in the Earth's upper atmosphere. These particles rain down on the surface of our planet constantly, billions of them every second, and they possess a remarkable property. They can pass through solid matter. Not all of them make it through, of course. Some are absorbed, and the rate of absorption depends on the density and thickness of the material they are passing through. A muon detector placed inside or beneath a structure can therefore create a kind of shadow map of what lies above it and around it. Dense stone absorbs more muons, creating darker shadows. Empty spaces, voids, chambers, and corridors absorb fewer muons, creating brighter spots on the detector's readout. The principle is the same as an X-ray, except instead of using a machine to generate radiation, the researchers let the cosmos itself provide the illumination. The Earth is constantly being bathed in muons. All the scientists need to do is listen. When this technology was turned on the Great Pyramid of Khufu in the mid-2010s, it revealed a previously unknown void above the Grand Gallery, a massive empty space at least 30 meters long. That discovery made headlines around the world and earned the nickname, the Big Void. But it was what happened next, when the same approach was applied to the area surrounding the Great Pyramid, that truly stunned the archaeological community. Ground-penetrating radar surveys, combined with electrical resistivity tomography, revealed the unmistakable signature of a large, structured anomaly buried in the bedrock of the plateau, not far from the base of the Great Pyramid itself. This was not a natural geological feature. Natural features do not produce the kind of clean, geometric signatures that the instruments were recording. This anomaly had walls, it had corners. It appeared to consist of 2 distinct components, a shallow section closer to the surface and a deeper section extending further into the bedrock, connected by what appeared to be a vertical shaft or passage. The implications were extraordinary. Here, on the most surveyed piece of real estate in the history of archaeology, was evidence of a substantial underground structure that no one had ever documented, no one had ever entered, and no one had even suspected was there. The researchers checked and rechecked their data. They ran the surveys multiple times, using different equipment and different methodologies. The anomaly persisted. It was real. The question, of course, was what it could be. The ancient Egyptians were prodigious builders of underground structures. They carved rock-cut tombs, subterranean temples, storage chambers, and ritual spaces throughout the Nile Valley and the surrounding deserts. The Giza Plateau itself sits atop a network of natural and artificial cavities, some of which have been explored and some of which have not. But the location of this particular anomaly, its proximity to the Great Pyramid, and its apparent size and complexity set it apart from the known inventory of underground features on the plateau. Some researchers speculated that it might be a previously undiscovered tomb, perhaps belonging to a member of the royal court or even to a figure of immense importance whose burial had been lost to history. Others suggested that it could be a functional space, a chamber used in the construction of the pyramid itself, perhaps for storing equipment or housing workers that had been sealed and forgotten after the pyramid's completion. Still others, more cautiously, noted that without direct physical access to the structure, any interpretation remained speculative, and that the anomaly could turn out to be less dramatic than the initial data suggested. But the very existence of the anomaly underscored a point that Egyptologists had been making for decades. We have barely scratched the surface of what the Giza Plateau contains. For every structure that is visible above ground, there may be several more hidden beneath it. The plateau is not simply a collection of monuments sitting on bedrock. It is a landscape that has been worked, carved, tunneled, and shaped by human hands over a period of centuries, and the full extent of that shaping remains unknown. To appreciate the scale of what we are dealing with, consider the Great Pyramid itself. It consists of approximately 2.3 million blocks of limestone and granite, with a total mass estimated at 6 million tons. It rises to a height of 138 meters, having lost its original capstone and several courses of outer casing stones over the millennia, and it covers a base area of more than 53,000 square meters. When it was completed around 2560 BCE, it was the tallest structure in the world, and it held that record for nearly 4,000 years, until the construction of Lincoln Cathedral in England in the 14th century CE. But the pyramid is not merely a pile of stacked blocks. Its interior is a labyrinth of passages, chambers, and shafts that have fascinated and mystified explorers since antiquity. The earliest known entry into the pyramid's interior was made by Caliph al-Mamun's workers in the 9th century CE, who tunneled through the limestone casing to bypass the original entrance, which was hidden behind a hinged stone block. What they found inside was a series of corridors, both ascending and descending, leading to three main chambers. The subterranean chamber carved into the bedrock beneath the pyramid, the so-called Queen's Chamber located in the body of the pyramid itself, and the King's Chamber, the largest of the three, which contains a granite sarcophagus and is roofed by 5 relieving chambers designed to distribute the immense weight of the stone above it. Each of these chambers raises its own set of questions. The subterranean chamber, for example, appears to be unfinished. Its floor is rough and uneven, and a narrow passage leads from it deeper into the bedrock before dead-ending in a blank wall. Why would the builders begin a chamber and then abandon it? Was it a change of plan during construction, a deliberate deception to mislead tomb robbers, or something else entirely? The Queen's Chamber, despite its name, almost certainly had nothing to do with a queen. The name was bestowed by Arab explorers based on a misunderstanding, and it has stuck. 2 narrow shafts extend from the north and south walls of this chamber, climbing at steep angles through the body of the pyramid. For years, it was assumed that these shafts were ventilation ducts, designed to provide air circulation to the workers constructing the interior passages. But robotic explorations in the 1990s and 2000s revealed that the shafts did not extend all the way to the outer surface of the pyramid. Instead, they were blocked by small stone slabs fitted with copper handles. When one of these slabs was drilled through by a robot equipped with a miniature camera, the camera revealed another stone slab behind the first one. What lies beyond that second slab remains unknown. No further exploration has been conducted, and the Egyptian authorities have been cautious about authorizing additional robotic missions. The shafts are narrow, roughly 20 centimeters square, and any intervention carries the risk of damaging the pyramid's internal structure. But the mystery persists. Why would the builders construct shafts that lead nowhere? Why would they seal them with carefully fitted stone blocks? And what, if anything, lies at their ultimate termination? These are not idle questions. The Great Pyramid is the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world that still exists, and it embodies a level of engineering precision that continues to astonish modern architects and engineers. The base of the pyramid is level to within just 2 centimeters across its entire 53,000 square meter footprint. Its sides are aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a degree. The joints between its casing stones, the few that remain in place, are so fine that a piece of paper cannot be inserted between them. This was not the work of a primitive society fumbling in the dark. This was the product of a civilization that possessed deep mathematical knowledge, sophisticated surveying techniques, advanced organizational capabilities, and a level of craftsmanship that would challenge the best stonemasons alive today. And yet, despite all of this, we still do not fully understand how the pyramid was built. The logistics alone are staggering. To complete the structure within the 20-year reign traditionally attributed to Khufu, the builders would have needed to quarry, transport, shape, and place an average of one block every 2 to 3 minutes, day and night, 7 days a week, for 2 decades. The granite beams that roof the king's chamber weigh up to 80 tons each and were transported from quarries at Aswan, more than 800 kilometers to the south. How were they moved? How were they lifted? How were they fitted with such precision? Various theories have been proposed over the years, from external ramps to internal ramps to systems of levers, counterweights, and water lubrication. Each theory explains some aspects of the construction but fails to account for others. The most recent and perhaps most compelling hypothesis, proposed by French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin, suggests that the pyramid was built using an internal spiral ramp, a gently inclined passage that wound its way up through the body of the pyramid, allowing blocks to be hauled upward without the need for an enormous external ramp that would have required almost as much material as the pyramid itself. Muon tomography has provided tentative evidence for the existence of such a ramp, but confirmation would require physical access, and that again is something the Egyptian authorities have been reluctant to authorize. The point is this: the Great Pyramid, the most famous and most studied ancient structure on Earth, still contains secrets. It still poses unanswered questions. And if the Great Pyramid can surprise us, then what else might be lurking beneath the sands of Giza, waiting to be found? The answer, it turns out, is quite a lot. Let us turn our attention to the second Great Pyramid on the Giza Plateau, the Pyramid of Khafre. Slightly smaller than the Great Pyramid but sitting on higher ground, which gives it the illusion of being taller, Khafre's pyramid is distinguished by the remnant of its original limestone casing that still clings to its apex, a rough white cap that gives it a distinctive appearance against the desert sky. The pyramid is traditionally dated to around 2520 BCE, placing it roughly a generation after the Great Pyramid, and it is associated with the pharaoh Khafre, who was either the son or the grandson of Khufu, depending on which reconstruction of the 4th dynasty genealogy one follows. Like the Great Pyramid, Khafre's pyramid has an internal chamber, reached by a descending passage cut into the bedrock. This chamber, the so-called burial chamber, contains a granite sarcophagus set into the floor, but it was found empty by Giovanni Belzoni, the Italian strongman turned archaeologist who first entered it in 1818. Whether it ever contained a royal mummy, and if so, what happened to that mummy, remains a matter of debate. But the real story of Khafre's pyramid lies not inside the pyramid itself, but beneath it. In recent years, researchers using ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies have identified a series of massive vertical shafts and chambers carved into the bedrock underneath and around the pyramid. These are not small, incidental features. They are large, deliberate, and architecturally significant. Some of the shafts extend to considerable depths, far deeper than the known internal passages of the pyramid, and they appear to connect to lateral chambers that spread outward beneath the pyramid's base. The existence of subterranean features beneath Egyptian pyramids is not, in itself, unusual. Many pyramids, particularly those of the Old Kingdom, have subterranean chambers that were part of the original design. The subterranean chamber beneath the Great Pyramid is one example. The step pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara sits above an entire network of tunnels and galleries carved into the bedrock, some of which were used for storage and some of which served ritual functions. But the shafts beneath Khafre's pyramid appear to be on a different scale, and their full extent has never been mapped. Part of the difficulty lies in access. The area immediately around the pyramid of Khafre is a controlled archaeological zone, and excavation is subject to strict regulations. The bedrock in this area is also notoriously fractured and unstable, making deep excavation risky. But the remote sensing data is clear. There are voids down there, significant ones, and their purpose and contents remain unknown. Some researchers have speculated that these shafts may be related to water. The ancient Egyptians had a deep symbolic and practical relationship with water, and several Old Kingdom sites show evidence of subterranean water features, including wells, cisterns, and channels that may have been used in ritual purification ceremonies. The Osirian at Abydos, though dating to a later period, provides a dramatic example of a subterranean structure designed to be partially filled with water, creating an artificial island that symbolized the primeval mound of creation. Could the shafts beneath Khafre's pyramid have served a similar function, Could they have tapped into the water table that lies beneath the Giza Plateau, channeling groundwater into subterranean chambers for ritual or symbolic purposes? It is an intriguing possibility, but without direct exploration, it remains speculation. What is not speculation, however, is the presence of the shafts themselves. They are there, they are real. And they represent yet another layer of complexity in our understanding of the Giza Plateau. And then there is the Sphinx. The Great Sphinx of Giza is one of the most recognizable monuments in the world, a colossal figure with the body of a lion and the head of a human, carved from a single ridge of natural limestone that protrudes from the bedrock of the plateau. It measures approximately 73 meters in length, 20 meters in height, and 6 meters in width at its shoulders. Its face, though battered by millennia of erosion, vandalism, and target practice by Mamluk soldiers, retains enough detail to suggest that it was originally carved as a portrait of a specific individual, almost certainly a pharaoh. The identity of that pharaoh has been debated for as long as Egyptology has existed as a discipline. The conventional attribution is to Khafre, based on the Sphinx's proximity to Khafre's Valley Temple and the causeway that connects the temple to the pyramid. But some researchers have argued for an earlier date, suggesting that the Sphinx may have been carved during the reign of Khufu, or even earlier, based on geological evidence of water erosion on its enclosure walls. This geological argument, first advanced in detail by geologist Robert Schoch in the early 1990s, has been the subject of fierce debate. Schoch argued that the pattern of erosion on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure was consistent with prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall, not the wind and sand erosion that characterizes the current climate of the Giza Plateau. Since the Sahara region last experienced significant rainfall during the late Neolithic subpluvial, which ended around 3000 BCE or perhaps earlier, Schoch suggested that the Sphinx might be considerably older than its conventional date of around 2500 BCE. Most Egyptologists have rejected this argument, pointing out that the limestone of the Giza Plateau is prone to a type of erosion called haliclicity, caused by the crystallization of salt within the rock, which can produce rounded, undulating erosion patterns similar to those caused by water. They also note that there is no archaeological evidence for a civilization capable of carving the Sphinx existing in Egypt prior to the Old Kingdom. But the debate has never been fully resolved, and it has kept the question of the Sphinx's age and origins in the public eye. More immediately relevant to our story, however, are the persistent questions about what lies beneath the Sphinx. Since the 19th century, there have been reports, rumors, and tantalizing hints that the Sphinx sits atop a network of chambers and tunnels. The earliest of these reports came from exploration efforts in the late 1800s, when researchers noted the presence of what appeared to be sealed entrances and blocked passages in the bedrock around and beneath the Sphinx. In the late 20th century, several remote sensing surveys were conducted on and around the Sphinx, using ground-penetrating radar, seismic refraction, and other techniques. These surveys produced intriguing results. Multiple teams, working independently and using different technologies, identified anomalies beneath the Sphinx that were consistent with the presence of voids or cavities in the bedrock. One particularly prominent anomaly was detected beneath the left paw of the Sphinx at a depth of several meters and appeared to be a roughly rectangular chamber. The existence of these anomalies has been confirmed by multiple surveys, but their nature remains uncertain. Some researchers have argued that they represent natural cavities in the limestone, which is known to be riddled with solution cavities, karst features, and other voids created by the dissolution of limestone by slightly acidic water over millions of years. Others have argued that the anomalies are too regular, too well defined, and too conveniently located to be natural, and that they must represent artificial chambers. The idea that secret chambers might exist beneath the Sphinx has a long and colorful history that predates modern remote sensing by many centuries. Ancient Egyptian texts refer to the Sphinx in ways that suggest it was associated with hidden knowledge and secret spaces. The so-called dream stele of Thutmose IV, erected between the Sphinx's front paws around 1400 BCE, tells the story of the young prince Thutmose falling asleep in the shadow of the Sphinx and receiving a message in a dream from the sun god, who promises him the throne of Egypt if he will clear away the sand that has buried the Sphinx up to its shoulders. This text implies that even in the New Kingdom, more than 1,000 years after the Sphinx was carved, it was already a monument of great antiquity and mystery. In more recent centuries, the idea of chambers beneath the Sphinx became associated with the concept of a hall of records, a legendary repository of ancient knowledge that some traditions claim was hidden beneath the monument. This concept gained widespread popular attention through the readings of Edgar Cayce, an American psychic of the early 20th century, who claimed that the Hall of Records contained documents and artifacts from the lost civilization of Atlantis. While mainstream Egyptologists dismiss the Hall of Records as a modern myth with no basis in ancient Egyptian texts or archaeology, the concept has proven remarkably durable in popular culture, and it continues to fuel interest in what might lie beneath the Sphinx. What is clear, setting aside mythology and speculation, is that the bedrock beneath the Sphinx has never been thoroughly explored. The Egyptian authorities have restricted access to the monument and its immediate surroundings, citing concerns about structural stability and the potential for damage. The Sphinx is, after all, a fragile monument. Its limestone body is heavily eroded, and it has been the subject of numerous conservation efforts over the past century. Any excavation beneath or around it would carry significant risks, but the anomalies remain, the data remains, and the questions remain: what is down there? Is it natural or artificial? And if it is artificial, who made it, when, and why? These questions about the Giza Plateau, about hidden chambers and unexplored shafts, about structures detected by instruments but never seen by human eyes, represent one thread in a much larger tapestry. Because the ancient world, it turns out, was full of hidden spaces, sealed chambers, and buried secrets, and the technology of the 21st century is revealing them at an unprecedented rate. Let us leave Egypt for a moment and travel to a very different part of the ancient world, to a place where the preservation of the dead reached a level of sophistication that rivals, and in some ways surpasses, anything achieved in the Nile Valley. The year was 1972. The place was the city of Changsha in China's Hunan province. Construction workers were digging an air raid shelter on the grounds of a hospital when their tools struck something unexpected: the outer edge of a massive underground structure, sealed and buried, that had lain undisturbed for more than 2,000 years. What followed was one of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The structure turned out to be a tomb, one of three belonging to the family of the Marquis of Dai, a minor nobleman who served the court of the Western Han dynasty in the 2nd century BCE. But it was not the Marquis's tomb that would make headlines around the world. It was the tomb of his wife, a woman known to history simply as Lady Dai, or by her formal name, Xinjui. When archaeologists opened Lady Dai's tomb, they found something that should have been impossible. Her body, sealed inside 4 nested coffins, immersed in an unknown brownish liquid, wrapped in silk and surrounded by a carefully controlled atmosphere, was almost perfectly preserved. Her skin was still soft and elastic, her joints could still be flexed, her internal organs were intact. When pathologists performed an autopsy, they found undigested melon seeds in her stomach and esophagus, suggesting that she had eaten melon shortly before her death. Her blood type could be determined. The cause of death could be established: a heart attack, likely triggered by coronary artery disease, exacerbated by obesity and gallstones. This was a woman who had died around 163 BCE, more than 2,100 years before the discovery of her tomb. And yet her body was in a condition that modern forensic pathologists described as comparable to a person who had been dead for only a few weeks. The preservation of Lady Dai's body was not the result of accident or natural conditions. It was the product of a deliberate, meticulously planned burial process that reflected the deep understanding of chemistry, materials science, and environmental control possessed by the people of the Western Han dynasty. The tomb itself was a testament to this understanding. It consisted of a large pit dug into the clay subsoil, at the bottom of which was a timber burial chamber divided into multiple compartments. The central compartment contained the coffins. The surrounding compartments contained the grave goods, an astonishing collection of more than 1,000 individual items that were intended to accompany Lady Dai into the afterlife and ensure her comfort and status in the world beyond death. The coffins were nested inside each other like Russian dolls, each one smaller than the last, each one more elaborately decorated. The outermost coffin was a plain wooden box, large and sturdy, designed to bear the weight of the earth above it. Inside this was a second coffin, painted black and decorated with a pattern of clouds and mythical creatures. Inside this was a third coffin, painted red and adorned with more intricate designs. And inside the third coffin was the innermost coffin, a masterpiece of lacquer work, covered in elaborate scenes of deities, spirits, and cosmic imagery rendered in vivid colors that had barely faded after 2 millennia underground. Lady Dai's body lay inside this innermost coffin, wrapped in more than 20 layers of silk and linen, bound with silk ribbons and immersed in the mysterious brownish liquid that has been the subject of intense scientific analysis. The composition of this liquid has never been definitively established. It contained trace amounts of mercury, which has antimicrobial properties, as well as various organic compounds. Some researchers have suggested that it was a deliberate embalming fluid, while others have argued that it was the result of chemical reactions between the body's decomposition products and the materials of the coffin and wrappings. Whatever its nature, the liquid was only one element of a multi-layered preservation system. The coffins were surrounded by a thick layer of white clay called kaolin, which is highly impermeable to water and air. Outside the clay was a layer of charcoal, which absorbed moisture and created a dry, chemically stable environment. The entire structure was then sealed with rammed earth, compacted to a density that made it nearly impervious to water infiltration. The result was a self-contained, hermetically sealed environment that maintained stable temperature, humidity, and chemical conditions for more than 2,000 years. No oxygen could reach the body, no bacteria could penetrate the barriers, no water could seep in to cause decay. It was, in effect, a time capsule, and it worked with an efficiency that astonishes modern conservation scientists. But Lady Di's body, remarkable as it was only part of the story. The grave goods that surrounded her coffins provided an extraordinarily detailed picture of daily life, material culture, and religious belief in the Western Han Dynasty. The tomb contained more than 100 lacquerware vessels, many of them still containing the remains of food and drink. There were dishes of rice, wheat, barley, and millet. There were cuts of venison, pork, beef, dog, rabbit, and various species of fish. There were eggs, fruit, and an array of condiments and seasonings. There were jars of wine and other beverages. The variety and quantity of the food suggested that Lady Di's family intended to provide her with a diet as rich and varied in death as it had been in life, and what a life it had been. The autopsy and analysis of Lady Di's body revealed that she had been a woman of considerable privilege. She was approximately 50 years old at the time of her death, about 1.54 meters tall, and significantly overweight. She suffered from coronary artery disease, arteriosclerosis, and gallstones, conditions consistent with a diet rich in animal fats and a sedentary lifestyle. She had a fused spinal disc, which would have caused chronic back pain, and she showed evidence of lead poisoning, likely from the lead-based cosmetics that were fashionable among the elite of the Han Dynasty. In addition to the food, the tomb contained a vast collection of textiles, including some of the finest silk fabrics ever recovered from the ancient world. The most famous of these was a gauze robe so light and delicate that it weighed only 49 grams, less than 50 grams for an entire full-length garment. This robe, which could be crumpled into a ball small enough to fit inside a modern matchbox, demonstrated a level of textile engineering that modern manufacturers have struggled to replicate. There were also hundreds of figurines, small wooden and clay sculptures representing servants, musicians, dancers, and attendants who would serve Lady Di in the afterlife. There were musical instruments, there were games and amusements, there were cosmetic cases containing combs, brushes, and mirrors. There were medicines and herbal remedies. There were books written on silk covering topics that ranged from military strategy to divination to calisthenics, a form of therapeutic exercise that the ancient Chinese practiced for health and longevity. Perhaps the most visually striking artifact from the tomb was the funeral banner, a T-shaped silk painting that had been draped over the innermost coffin. This banner, known as a flying garment or fei, depicted a cosmological scene of extraordinary complexity and beauty. At the top was the realm of heaven, populated by gods, mythical creatures, and celestial bodies, including the sun containing a crow and the moon containing a toad and a rabbit. In the middle was the earthly realm, showing Lady Di herself leaning on a walking stick, attended by servants, receiving offerings. At the bottom was the underworld, depicted as a watery realm supported by a giant figure, possibly the earth deity, standing on the backs of intertwined sea creatures. The banner was not merely decorative. It served a ritual function, guiding Lady Di's soul on its journey from the earthly realm to the celestial realm, ensuring that she would find her way to the appropriate level of the cosmos and take her rightful place among the immortals. It was, in essence, a roadmap to the afterlife, painted in vivid mineral pigments that had survived 2 millennia in the sealed darkness of the tomb, with barely any fading. The discovery of Lady Di's tomb transformed our understanding of the Western Han Dynasty and its material culture. Before the excavation, historians had relied primarily on written texts and a relatively small number of surviving artifacts to reconstruct the daily life and beliefs of this period. The tomb provided a comprehensive, three-dimensional snapshot of an elite Han household, complete with its food, clothing, entertainment, medicine, and religious practices. It was as if someone had taken a wealthy Chinese home of the 2nd century BCE and preserved it in its entirety for future generations to study. But perhaps the most profound lesson of the discovery was not about the Han dynasty at all. It was about the human impulse to conquer death, to preserve the body and the identity of the deceased against the ravages of time, to ensure that something of the individual endured beyond the grave. This impulse, which manifested itself in the elaborate embalming techniques of ancient Egypt, in the terracotta armies of Qin Shi Huang, in the bog burials of northern Europe, and in countless other funerary traditions around the world, found one of its most sophisticated expressions in the tomb of Lady Di. And the fact that it worked, that after more than 2,000 years, her body was still recognizably human, still soft to the touch, still capable of yielding medical information to modern pathologists, is a testament not only to the skill of the ancient embalmers, but to the depth and seriousness with which the ancient world approached the mystery of death. We return now to Egypt, but to a different kind of mystery, not a hidden chamber or a preserved body, but a puzzle of language, a code that took centuries to crack and that, when it was finally broken, opened a window into one of the richest and most complex civilizations the world has ever known. For most of recorded history, the writing of ancient Egypt was a closed book. The elaborate hieroglyphic inscriptions that covered the walls of temples, tombs, obelisks, and sarcophagi were visible to anyone who visited Egypt, but no one could read them. The knowledge of how to interpret these beautiful, enigmatic signs had been lost, destroyed by the gradual decline of the ancient Egyptian civilization, the rise of Christianity, the closing of the pagan temples, and the suppression of the priestly class that had been the custodians of the hieroglyphic tradition. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in the Temple of Philae, on an island in the Nile near Aswan, in the year 394 CE. After that, silence. The script that had recorded the thoughts, prayers, laws, histories, and daily transactions of one of history's greatest civilizations became nothing more than decoration, admired for its beauty but understood by no one. For nearly 14 centuries, the hieroglyphs remained mute. Scholars and travelers who visited Egypt's monuments could only guess at their meaning. Some guessed well, others guessed wildly. The dominant theory, inherited from the Greek philosopher Horapollo, held that hieroglyphs were not phonetic symbols representing sounds, as in an alphabet, but ideographic symbols, each one representing a complete idea or concept. According to this view, the image of a bird did not represent the sound of a word. It represented the concept of bird, or perhaps soul, or flight, or some other abstract idea. This interpretation treated hieroglyphs as a kind of symbolic picture writing, rich in allegory and mysticism, but fundamentally different from the phonetic scripts used by the Greeks, Romans, and other civilizations. This was wrong. And as long as scholars clung to this interpretation, the hieroglyphs remained unreadable. The breakthrough came, as breakthroughs often do, from an unexpected direction. In 1799, during Napoleon Bonaparte's military campaign in Egypt, a group of French soldiers was demolishing a wall in the fort of Rashid, a town on the western branch of the Nile Delta known to Europeans by its medieval name, Rosetta. Embedded in the wall was a slab of dark granodiorite, a type of igneous rock, covered on one face with text in 3 different scripts. The stone was not particularly impressive to look at. It was roughly the size of a modern coffee table, somewhat damaged, with chunks missing from its upper left corner and lower right corner, but the text it carried was extraordinary. The same passage, a decree issued by a council of Egyptian priests in 196 BCE, honoring the pharaoh Ptolemy V Epiphanes, was written 3 times, once in hieroglyphic script, once in a cursive script known as Demotic, and once in ancient Greek. The significance of this was immediately recognized. Greek was a known language. If the 3 texts said the same thing, then the Greek text could serve as a key to unlocking the Egyptian scripts. The stone was a bilingual, a translation key, a decoder ring for one of history's greatest linguistic puzzles. But the decipherment did not happen overnight. It took more than 2 decades of painstaking work by some of the finest minds in Europe, and it was marked by fierce rivalries, dead ends, brilliant insights, and moments of near despair. The first major contributor was Thomas Young, an English polymath whose interests ranged from physics to medicine to linguistics. Young was a genius in the truest sense of the word, a man who had taught himself to read at the age of 2, who had mastered 6 ancient languages by his teens, and who made fundamental contributions to the theory of light, the study of elasticity, and the decipherment of Egyptian texts. Young was the first to demonstrate that some hieroglyphic signs were phonetic, not ideographic. He did this by studying the cartouches, the oval rings that enclosed royal names on the Rosetta Stone and on other Egyptian monuments. Young reasoned that foreign names, such as the Greek name Ptolemy, would have to be spelled out phonetically, since there would be no existing ideographic symbol for a Greek name. By comparing the hieroglyphic signs inside the cartouche for Ptolemy with the Greek spelling of the name, Young was able to identify several individual hieroglyphic signs and their phonetic values. This was a crucial insight, but Young did not carry it far enough. He continued to believe that the phonetic principle applied only to foreign names and that the bulk of the hieroglyphic script was still ideographic. He was wrong about this, and his partial understanding, while valuable, was not sufficient to crack the code. That achievement fell to a young Frenchman named Jean-François Champollion, and the story of his decipherment is one of the great intellectual adventures of the modern era. Champollion was born in 1790 in the town of Figeac in southwestern France. He showed extraordinary linguistic talent from an early age, and by his teenage years he had mastered Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Arabic, Chaldean, Syriac, Chinese, Coptic, Ethiopic, Sanskrit, Avestan, Pahlavi, and Persian, among others. He was, by any measure, one of the most prodigious linguists who ever lived, but it was his mastery of Coptic that proved decisive. Coptic was the latest form of the ancient Egyptian language, written not in hieroglyphs but in an alphabet derived from Greek, with a few additional letters borrowed from the Demotic script. Coptic had survived as the liturgical language of the Egyptian Christian Church, and Champollion had taught himself to speak and write it fluently. He understood its grammar, its vocabulary, and its relationship to the earlier forms of the Egyptian language recorded in hieroglyphic and Demotic texts. This gave Champollion an advantage that no other researcher possessed. He did not merely know the shapes of the hieroglyphic signs, he knew the language that those signs recorded, and this knowledge allowed him to see what others had missed. Champollion's breakthrough came on September 14, 1822, a date that is sometimes called the birthday of Egyptology. He was working with copies of inscriptions from the Temple of Abu Simbel in Upper Egypt, and he focused his attention on a cartouche that contained 4 hieroglyphic signs. The last 2 signs were identical, and he knew from Young's work that they represented the sound S. The first sign was a circle with a dot in the center, which Champollion, drawing on his knowledge of Coptic, recognized as the symbol for the sun, pronounced Ra in ancient Egyptian. The second sign was a series of angled lines that he identified as representing the sound MS or Mies. Rames SS Rameses. The cartouche spelled out the name of one of the most famous pharaohs in Egyptian history, Rameses the Great, but this was not a foreign name. This was an ancient Egyptian name. If the hieroglyphs could spell out native Egyptian names phonetically, then the phonetic principle was not limited to foreign words. It was a fundamental feature of the entire hieroglyphic system. According to one account, possibly embellished by later biographers, Champollion rushed into the office of his brother, Jacques Joseph, shouted "Gitines el affaire," meaning "I have got it," and then collapsed to the floor in a dead faint, remaining unconscious for 5 days from the sheer intensity of the intellectual effort and emotional excitement. Whether or not the feint actually occurred, the decipherment was real and it was revolutionary. Over the following years, Champollion refined and expanded his understanding of the hieroglyphic system, publishing his results in a series of landmark works, including his famous Lettre à M. Dacier in 1822 and his comprehensive Précis du système hieroglyphique in 1824. He demonstrated that hieroglyphs operated on multiple levels simultaneously. Some signs were purely phonetic, representing 1, 2, or 3 consonants. Some were logograms, representing entire words, and some were determinatives, silent signs placed at the end of a word to indicate its general category of meaning. The system was far more complex and flexible than anyone had imagined, and it required an intimate knowledge of the ancient Egyptian language to read correctly. Champollion's decipherment opened a floodgate. Within decades, scholars were reading texts that had been silent for millennia. Temple inscriptions, tomb autobiographies, medical papyri, love poems, legal contracts, diplomatic correspondence, religious hymns, mathematical treatises, astronomical observations, and royal decrees. All of these poured forth from the monuments and papyri of ancient Egypt, transforming a civilization that had been known only through the distorted lens of Greek and Roman writers into one that could speak for itself, in its own voice, in its own language. The impact on historical understanding was immense. Before Champollion, the history of ancient Egypt was a patchwork of myths, legends, and second-hand accounts, dominated by the narrative of the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE and recorded a mixture of accurate observations and wildly inaccurate hearsay. After Champollion, the history of Egypt could be reconstructed from primary sources, from the words of the Egyptians themselves. Kings could be identified, dynasties could be dated, religious beliefs could be understood, administrative systems could be analyzed, and the daily lives of ordinary people, their hopes, their fears, their complaints about their bosses, their love letters to their spouses, their recipes, their jokes, could be glimpsed through the texts they left behind. One of the most poignant examples of this newly accessible literature was a series of letters found in the workers' village of Deir el-Medina on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. These letters, written on broken pieces of pottery and flakes of limestone known as ostraca, record the daily concerns of the men who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. They wrote about their rations of bread and beer. They complained about late payments. They went on strike when their wages were not delivered on time, in what may be the earliest recorded labor strike in history. They gossiped about their neighbors. They sought remedies for illnesses. They mourned their dead. They celebrated their children's births. These were not pharaohs or priests or generals. These were ordinary working people, and thanks to Champollion's decipherment, their voices could be heard across a gap of more than 3,000 years. It was and remains one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of scholarship. But the decipherment also revealed something else, the sheer volume of what remained to be discovered. As scholars gained the ability to read Egyptian texts, they realized that the ancient Egyptians had been prolific writers, recording everything from the most solemn religious rituals to the most mundane administrative transactions. The volume of surviving textual material is vast, encompassing tens of thousands of individual inscriptions and documents, and a significant proportion of this material has still not been fully published, translated, or analyzed. Every year, new texts are discovered, sometimes in unexpected places. Inscriptions are found on the walls of newly excavated tombs. Papyri are recovered from ancient rubbish dumps. Ostraca are unearthed in the fill of archaeological sites. And each new text has the potential to fill a gap in our knowledge, to answer an old question, or to raise new questions that no one had thought to ask. The decipherment of the hieroglyphs did not solve the mysteries of ancient Egypt. In many ways, it deepened them. But it gave us the tools to engage with those mysteries on the Egyptians' own terms, and that has made all the difference. Let us now turn to a mystery of a different kind, one that takes us away from the familiar ground of Egypt and into the labyrinthine palace complex of ancient Crete, where a small clay disk, about 15 centimeters in diameter and covered on both sides with a spiral arrangement of stamped symbols, has been baffling scholars for more than a century. The Phaistos disk was discovered in 1908 by the Italian archaeologist Luigi Pernier during his excavation of the Minoan Palace of Phaistos, on the south-central coast of Crete. The Palace of Phaistos was one of the great administrative and ceremonial centers of the Minoan civilization, which flourished on Crete from approximately 2700 to 1450 BCE and produced some of the earliest complex societies in Europe. The Minoans built elaborate multi-story palaces, developed sophisticated systems of administration and trade, produced exquisite works of art, and created at least two writing systems, known to modern scholars as Linear A and Linear B. Linear B was deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris, who demonstrated that it recorded an early form of Greek. Linear A, however, remains undeciphered, and the language it records is unknown. But neither Linear A nor Linear B bears any resemblance to the symbols on the Phaistos disk. The disk appears to represent a third writing system, one that is entirely unique. No other example of this script has ever been found anywhere in the world. The disk is made of fired clay, and its symbols were not inscribed by hand but stamped into the clay using individual punches, each one carved with a specific symbol. This has led some scholars to describe the Phaistos disk as the world's earliest example of movable type, a technology that would not be reinvented for more than 3,000 years. There are 242 individual symbol impressions on the disk, grouped into 61 clusters separated by vertical lines. The symbols include representations of people, animals, plants, tools, and geometric shapes. Some are easily recognizable: a walking man, a running man, a woman, a child, a bird, a fish, a flower, a shield, a ship, an arrow, a helmet with a crest. Others are more abstract and difficult to identify. The symbols are arranged in a spiral pattern, starting from the outer edge of the disk and winding inward toward the center. This arrangement has been interpreted by some as indicating the direction of reading, from outside to inside, while others have argued the reverse, from inside to outside. Some have even suggested that the spiral arrangement is not related to the reading direction at all, but is purely decorative or symbolic. Hundreds of attempts have been made to decipher the Phaistos disk, and none has achieved general acceptance. The fundamental problem is the small size of the corpus. With only 242 symbol impressions and 45 distinct sign types, there is simply not enough text to apply the standard techniques of decipherment. Frequency analysis, pattern matching, and combinatorial logic, the tools that enabled the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs, Linear B, Mesopotamian cuneiform, and other scripts, require a reasonably large body of text to work with. The Phaistos disk provides too little data for these methods to yield reliable results. Various theories about the disk's content have been proposed over the years. Some scholars have suggested that it is a religious text, perhaps a hymn or a prayer. Others have proposed that it is a legal document, a list of place names, or a political treaty. One imaginative interpretation suggested that it is an ancient board game. Another proposed that it is a calendar. Still another argued that it is a narrative text telling the story of a military campaign. But without a confirmed decipherment, all of these interpretations remain speculative. The Phaistos disk stands as a reminder that some mysteries of the ancient world may never be solved, not because the evidence has been destroyed, but because there is simply not enough of it to work with. There are those who question whether the disk is even genuine. Some scholars have pointed to the uniqueness of the artifact, its use of stamped rather than inscribed symbols, and the absence of any comparable objects from the Minoan world as reasons to suspect that it might be a modern forgery, perhaps created by Pernier himself or by someone who planted it in the excavation for Pernier to find. These suspicions have never been substantiated, and thermoluminescence dating has confirmed that the clay was fired in antiquity, consistent with a date in the 2nd millennium BCE. But the doubts persist, fueled by the disk's anomalous character and the frustrating impossibility of reading it. Whatever the Phaistos disk is, it stands as one of the most tantalizing objects in the history of archaeology, a message from the past that we can see but cannot understand, a locked door for which we may never find the key. From the unsolved puzzle of the Phaistos disk, let us move to an even more ancient mystery, one that predates writing, predates civilization, and predates even the species that created the disk. In 1976, a team of paleontologists led by Mary Leakey was working at a site called Litali in northern Tanzania, about 45 kilometers south of the famous Olduvai Gorge. They were studying deposits of volcanic ash that had been laid down by an eruption of the nearby volcano Sadaman approximately 3.6 million years ago. During one of those peculiar moments that punctuate the history of science, a member of the team was engaging in a playful elephant dung fight with a colleague when he stumbled, and looking down to see what had tripped him, noticed a series of depressions in the hardened ash that looked remarkably like footprints. They were footprints, but not the footprints of any creature that walks the earth today. They were the footprints of hominins, early human ancestors, who had walked across the freshly fallen volcanic ash 3.6 million years ago, leaving their tracks in the soft, moist surface before it hardened into a cement-like rock called tuff. The Litali footprints are among the most significant discoveries in the history of paleoanthropology. They provide direct physical evidence that our distant ancestors were walking upright on two legs, a posture known as bipedalism, at least 3.6 million years ago, far earlier than many scientists had previously believed. The footprints show a clear heel strike, a well-defined arch, and a forward-pointing big toe, all features that are characteristic of the modern human gait and that distinguish our walk from the flat-footed, divergent-toed locomotion of the great apes. The trackway extends for approximately 27 meters and preserves the footprints of at least two individuals, possibly three, walking in the same direction. The larger set of prints has been attributed to an adult, while the smaller set appears to belong to a juvenile or a smaller individual walking alongside the first. A third, even smaller set of prints appears to overlap with the larger set, as if a third individual was walking in the larger individual's footsteps. The species responsible for the footprints is generally believed to be Australopithecus afarensis, the same species to which the famous fossil, Lucy, belongs. Lucy, discovered by Donald Johanson in Ethiopia in 1974, was a small-brained, ape-like creature who stood about 1.1 meters tall but walked upright on two legs. The Litali footprints provided the smoking gun that confirmed what Lucy's skeletal anatomy had suggested. These creatures were bipedal. But the footprints also raise questions that skeletal anatomy alone cannot answer. Why were these individuals walking across the volcanic ash? Where were they going? Were they a family group, a parent and child, walking together? Were they fleeing the eruption of the volcano, or had the eruption already subsided, leaving behind a landscape of cooling ash that they were crossing in search of food or water? We cannot know. The footprints record a single moment, a few minutes at most, in the lives of creatures who lived and died 3.6 million years ago. But they are enough to bridge an almost incomprehensible gulf of time and to connect us, in the most visceral and immediate way possible, to our earliest ancestors. There is something profoundly moving about the Litali footprints. They are not tools or bones or teeth. They are not the durable, mineralized remains of bodies or artifacts. They are traces, impressions, the ghosts of a moment long past. They record the simple, universal act of walking, of putting one foot in front of the other, of moving through the world. And they remind us that the creatures who made them were, in this most fundamental way, just like us. We return now to Egypt and to a discovery that combines engineering ingenuity with artistic beauty in a way that challenges our assumptions about what ancient societies were capable of creating. Deep within the temple complex at Dendera in Upper Egypt stands a shrine dedicated to the goddess Hathor, one of the most important deities in the ancient Egyptian pantheon. Hathor was associated with love, music, dance, fertility, and the sky, and she was typically depicted as a woman with the ears of a cow, or less frequently, as a cow itself. The temple at Dendera, which dates primarily to the Ptolemaic and Roman periods, though its foundations may be much older, is one of the best preserved temple complexes in Egypt, and it is renowned for its elaborate astronomical ceiling, its vivid colors, and its detailed reliefs depicting the rituals and festivals associated with the Hathor cult. Among the many remarkable features of the Dendera temple is a statue of the goddess Hathor that, upon close examination, reveals a level of mechanical sophistication that few visitors would expect from an ancient Egyptian artifact. The statue, which depicts Hathor in her characteristic human form with cow ears, was designed to be operated by a system of ropes and pulleys concealed within the walls and structure of the shrine. This mechanism allowed the priests to animate the statue during religious ceremonies, causing it to move its arms, tilt its head, or perform other motions that would have appeared miraculous to the assembled worshippers. The use of mechanical devices in religious contexts was not unique to ancient Egypt. The temples of the ancient Greek world, particularly those of the Hellenistic period, are known to have employed a range of mechanical tricks to awe the faithful, including doors that opened and closed automatically, statues that poured libations, and devices that used steam or compressed air to produce sounds or movements. The great engineer Hero of Alexandria, who lived in the 1st century CE, wrote detailed descriptions of many such devices in his treatise Pneumatica, and some of his designs are remarkably ingenious. But the Hathor statue at Dendera predates Hero by several centuries, and it demonstrates that the ancient Egyptians, long before the flowering of Greek mechanical engineering, had developed their own traditions of automata and mechanical devices for use in religious ceremonies. The pulley system used to operate the Hathor statue was not a crude improvisation. It was a carefully designed and precisely fabricated mechanism, with channels cut into the stone to guide the ropes, counterweights to balance the loads, and concealed access points that allowed the priests to operate the device without being seen by the worshippers. The existence of such mechanisms raises intriguing questions about the level of technological sophistication achieved by ancient Egyptian engineers. We know from other sources that the Egyptians were skilled in the use of simple machines, including levers, inclined planes, and rollers. We know that they used water-lifting devices such as the shaduf and, later, the Archimedean screw. We know that they had a sophisticated understanding of geometry, surveying, and structural engineering. But the mechanical statue at Dendera suggests that their technological repertoire may have been even broader than we typically assume, encompassing the design and construction of complex mechanical devices that combined multiple simple machines into integrated systems. It is worth pausing to consider the psychological impact that such a device would have had on the ancient worshippers. Imagine standing in the dim, incense-filled interior of the temple, surrounded by painted columns and flickering lamplight, watching as the statue of the goddess appeared to come alive, to move, to gesture, to respond to the prayers and offerings of the priests. For a person who did not understand the mechanics behind the movement, the experience would have been profoundly awe-inspiring, perhaps even terrifying. It would have confirmed their belief in the power and presence of the goddess, and it would have reinforced the authority of the priests who served as intermediaries between the divine and the mortal worlds. This is not to suggest that the Egyptians were cynically manipulating their worshippers. The priests who operated the mechanism almost certainly believed in the goddess they served, and they may have understood the mechanical device not as a trick, but as a means by which the goddess chose to manifest her presence. The distinction between real, divine manifestation and mechanical simulation is a modern one, rooted in a materialist worldview that would have been foreign to the ancient Egyptians. For them, the movement of the statue may have been entirely genuine, a sign that the goddess was present in her image, brought to life by the power of ritual and prayer, with the mechanical device serving merely as the medium through which her divine will was expressed. This perspective is important because it reminds us that technology in the ancient world was not separate from religion, art, or social life. It was embedded in all of these, inseparable from the cultural context that gave it meaning. The mechanical Hathor statue was not a toy or a novelty. It was a sacred object, designed and built to serve a sacred purpose, and it must be understood in those terms. Speaking of sacred objects and the divine purpose of material culture in ancient Egypt, it is impossible to discuss the civilization of the Nile without considering the river itself and the extraordinary vessels that traveled upon it. The Nile was, in every sense, the lifeblood of ancient Egypt. It provided water for drinking and irrigation, fertile soil for agriculture, fish and waterfowl for food, papyrus reeds for writing material, and a transportation highway that linked the scattered communities of the Nile Valley into a unified civilization stretching more than 1,000 kilometers from the Mediterranean coast to the first cataract at Aswan. The importance of the river to Egyptian culture is reflected in every aspect of Egyptian art, literature, and religion. The annual inundation of the Nile, which deposited a layer of rich black silt on the floodplain every summer, was celebrated as a divine gift, the work of the god Hapi, who was depicted as a plump, androgynous figure bearing trays of food and flowers. The Egyptians oriented their entire worldview around the river. The east bank where the sun rose was the land of the living. The west bank where the sun set was the land of the dead. The pyramids and tombs were built on the west bank. The cities and temples were built on the east bank, and the river itself was the boundary between the two, the threshold between life and death. Given the centrality of the Nile to Egyptian life, it is not surprising that the Egyptians were accomplished boat builders. Evidence of Egyptian watercraft stretches back to the pre-dynastic period, more than 5,000 years ago, and the evolution of Egyptian boat design can be traced through tomb paintings, relief carvings, models, and most dramatically, through the survival of actual boats that were buried as part of royal funerary equipment. The most famous of these is the Khufu ship, discovered in 1954 in a sealed pit at the base of the Great Pyramid. This magnificent vessel, constructed of Lebanese cedar, was 43 meters long and had been disassembled into 1,224 individual pieces, carefully stacked in the pit and sealed with massive limestone blocks. When reassembled by the Egyptian restorer Ahmed Youssef Mustafa over a period of 14 years, the ship proved to be a fully functional, seaworthy vessel of breathtaking beauty and craftsmanship. The Khufu ship was built using a technique known as shell-first construction, in which the hull planks were shaped and fastened together to form the outer shell of the vessel before any internal framing was added. The planks were joined using a combination of mortise and tenon joints and lashings of halfa grass, a flexible natural fiber that swelled when wet, tightening the joints and making the hull watertight. No nails or metal fasteners were used anywhere in the construction. The vessel's design was elegant and practical. Its long, narrow hull had a graceful upward curve at both bow and stern, giving it the characteristic crescent shape that is familiar from Egyptian art. It was equipped with 5 pairs of oars and a large steering oar at the stern. A cabin or deckhouse, constructed of wooden frames covered with woven matting, occupied the center of the deck, providing shelter for the vessel's occupants. Whether the Khufu ship ever sailed on the Nile is a matter of debate. Some scholars have argued that it was a purely symbolic vessel, a solar bark intended to carry the pharaoh's soul across the sky in the company of the sun god Ra. Others have pointed to evidence of wear on the hull and oars as suggesting that the ship was actually used, at least for the funeral procession that carried Khufu's body to its final resting place. But the Khufu ship, magnificent as it is, was only one example of the elaborate boats that the Egyptian elite used on the Nile. Throughout Egyptian history, the river was crowded with vessels of every size and description, from small papyrus skiffs used by fishermen and hunters to massive royal barges that served as floating palaces for the pharaohs. These royal barges were, by all accounts, extraordinary vessels. They were lavishly decorated with gold, precious stones, and painted reliefs. They were furnished with luxurious cabins containing beds, chairs, and tables of the finest craftsmanship. They were equipped with canopies of dyed linen or silk to shield their occupants from the sun, and they were staffed by crews of oarsmen, musicians, servants, and guards. The royal barge was not merely a means of transportation. It was a symbol of royal power and divine authority. When the pharaoh sailed on the Nile, he was reenacting the journey of the sun god across the sky, and his barge was a terrestrial reflection of the solar bark that carried Ra from east to west. The elaborate decoration and furnishing of the barge reinforced this symbolic connection, surrounding the pharaoh with images and objects that identified him with the gods and confirmed his role as the mediator between the divine and mortal worlds. Later periods of Egyptian history saw the construction of even more elaborate vessels. During the Ptolemaic period, the Greek-speaking rulers of Egypt commissioned enormous pleasure barges that combined Egyptian boat-building traditions with Greek and Hellenistic design elements. The most famous of these was the Thalamigos of Ptolemy IV Philopator, a massive double-hulled vessel that was essentially a floating palace, complete with dining rooms, bedrooms, shrines, gardens, and colonnaded promenades. According to ancient descriptions, the Thalamigos was approximately 115 meters long and 14 meters wide, making it one of the largest vessels built in the ancient world. The existence of such vessels reminds us that the ancient Egyptians were not only architects and sculptors, but also engineers and craftsmen of the highest order. Their skills in woodworking, joinery, and naval architecture were every bit as impressive as their achievements in stone construction, and they produced vessels that, in terms of size, beauty, and sophistication, would not be equaled for many centuries. Let us now journey to a place that seems, at first glance, to have nothing in common with the fertile valley of the Nile. Let us go to the Sinai Peninsula, the great triangle of desert and mountain that hangs like a pendant between Africa and Asia, its western shore washed by the Gulf of Suez, its eastern shore by the Gulf of Aqaba, and its northern coast by the Mediterranean Sea. For most of recorded history, the Sinai has been regarded as a barrier, a desolate wasteland of sand, gravel, and bare rock, too hot and dry to support anything more than the most meager forms of life. It was the wilderness through which the Israelites wandered for 40 years, according to the biblical narrative. It was the no-man's land that separated Egypt from the empires of the East. It was, in the popular imagination, a place of emptiness and desolation, interesting only as a thing to be crossed on the way to somewhere more hospitable. This view of the Sinai was never entirely accurate, and recent archaeological discoveries have exposed it as deeply misleading. The Sinai was not empty. It was not desolate. It was, at various points in its history, a thriving, strategically vital corridor of trade, military movement, and industrial activity, and the physical evidence for this is now emerging from the sand. The most dramatic of these discoveries was made at a site known as Tel El Borg in the northern Sinai, close to the modern Suez Canal. This site, known in ancient Egyptian texts as Tijaru or Tharu, was the starting point of the Ways of Horus, the ancient military and trade road that ran along the Mediterranean coast from Egypt to the land of Canaan and beyond. Egyptian texts describe Tijaru as a fortified border town, the gateway through which armies marched on their way to campaign in the Levant and through which trade goods flowed into Egypt from the east. For years, the exact location of Tijaru had been uncertain. Various sites in the northern Sinai had been proposed as candidates, but none had been confirmed. Then in the early 2000s, excavations at Tel El Borg, led by a team from a major research institution, revealed the remains of a massive military fortress that matched the descriptions of Tijaru in ancient texts with remarkable precision. The fortress was enormous, far larger than anyone had expected. It covered an area of several acres and was surrounded by massive mud brick walls, some of which stood to a height of several meters even after thousands of years of erosion and sand accumulation. The walls were reinforced with towers at regular intervals, and the entire complex was surrounded by a dry moat or ditch that would have made approach difficult for any attacker. But the fortress was only part of the discovery. The excavations also revealed something that no one had anticipated: a tree-lined boulevard running through the center of the settlement, flanked by what appeared to be an irrigation system that had kept the trees alive in the middle of the desert. This was extraordinary. The idea that the ancient Egyptians had constructed an irrigated, tree-lined avenue in the heart of the Sinai Desert challenged everything that scholars had assumed about the region. Trees require water, and water in the Sinai is scarce. For the Egyptians to have maintained a boulevard of living trees in this environment, they would have needed a reliable water source, a system for distributing water to the trees, and a commitment to ongoing maintenance and care. This was not a temporary military camp. This was a permanent, well-maintained settlement with amenities and infrastructure that rivaled those found in the Nile Valley itself. further excavation revealed additional surprises. The settlement included what appeared to be industrial hubs, areas where raw materials were processed and manufactured goods were produced. Evidence of metalworking was found, including furnaces, crucibles, and slag, the waste product of smelting. The Sinai has been known since antiquity as a source of copper and turquoise, and the ancient Egyptians operated mines in the peninsula's mountainous interior from at least the Old Kingdom onward. But the industrial activity at Tijaru suggested that the processing of these raw materials was not confined to the mining sites themselves. It was also taking place at the border fortress, where the materials were being refined and fashioned into finished goods before being shipped into Egypt. The fortress also yielded a rich collection of artifacts that illuminated the daily life of its garrison. There were storage jars containing the remains of grain, oil, and wine. There were weapons including arrowheads, spearpoints, and fragments of swords. There were seals and seal impressions bearing the names and titles of Egyptian officials. There were pottery shards from Canaan, Cyprus, and the Aegean, evidence of the international trade that passed through the fortress. And there were ostraca-inscribed pottery fragments, bearing administrative texts that recorded the comings and goings of travelers, the distribution of rations, and the movements of military units. The picture that emerged from the excavations was one of a vibrant, bustling frontier settlement, not the lonely outpost in a barren wasteland that scholars had imagined. Tijaru was a place where soldiers, administrators, merchants, craftsmen, and travelers converged, where goods from 3 continents were exchanged, where raw materials were transformed into finished products, and where the might of the Egyptian state was projected eastward into Asia. The discovery also shed new light on the military campaigns of the New Kingdom pharaohs. Egyptian texts describe the departure of royal armies from Tijaru, marching east along the ways of Horus toward the Levant, and the fortress at Tel El Borg provided the physical reality behind these textual descriptions. The massive walls, the towers, the moat, the storage facilities, and the industrial areas were all consistent with a major military staging area, a place where armies were assembled, equipped, and supplied before setting out on campaign. Thutmose III, the great warrior pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, launched his famous campaign against the Canaanite coalition at Megiddo from Tijaru. Ramesses II of the 19th dynasty passed through Tijaru on his way to the Battle of Kadesh against the Hittites. Merneptah, Ramesses' son and successor, marched through Tijaru to suppress a rebellion in Canaan, recording his victory on the famous Merneptah stele, which contains the earliest known reference to Israel. For all of these pharaohs and their armies, Tijaru was the last outpost of Egyptian civilization before the desert, the point of no return. And now, thanks to the excavations at Tel El Borg, we can see what that outpost actually looked like, how it functioned, and what it meant to the people who lived and worked there. But the fortress at Tel El Borg was not an isolated installation. It was part of a chain of fortifications that lined the ways of Horus, stretching from the Nile Delta to the border of Canaan. Egyptian reliefs, particularly those on the exterior walls of the Great Temple at Karnak, depict this chain of forts in detail, showing a series of fortified towns connected by a road and separated by water sources, presumably wells or cisterns. The excavations in the northern Sinai have identified several of these forts on the ground, confirming the accuracy of the Karnak reliefs and revealing a military infrastructure of impressive scale and sophistication. The existence of this infrastructure demolishes the old idea that the Sinai was merely a barren barrier between Egypt and the East. It was instead a carefully managed military zone, a fortified corridor that the Egyptians controlled, maintained, and defended with the same diligence that they applied to the defense of the Nile Valley itself. The desert was not a boundary. It was a highway, and the Egyptians had paved it with fortresses. The discoveries at Tel El Borg remind us that archaeology is, at its heart, a process of revision. We think we understand the past, and then a new discovery forces us to reconsider. We think we know where the important sites are, and then the ground opens up and reveals something we never expected. The ancient world is full of surprises, and we would be foolish to assume that the major discoveries have all been made. This spirit of revision and surprise animates one of the most recent and most exciting discoveries in Egyptian archaeology: the unearthing of a forgotten city near the Mediterranean coast, buried beneath the ruins of a later Greek settlement, that has provided new insights into one of the most turbulent and least understood periods of Egyptian history. The city was found near the modern village of Budo in the northwestern Nile Delta, a region that has been intensively cultivated for millennia and that, as a result, has received less archaeological attention than the desert sites of Upper Egypt, where monuments are preserved by the arid climate and are often visible on the surface. The delta, by contrast, is a challenging environment for archaeology. The water table is high, the soil is damp and acidic, and organic materials that would survive indefinitely in the dry desert decompose quickly in the wet conditions of the north. Despite these challenges, excavations in the delta have yielded important discoveries, and the find near Buto was among the most significant. Beneath the remains of a Greco-Roman settlement, archaeologists uncovered the foundations and artifacts of an earlier Egyptian city that had been occupied during the late 18th dynasty, one of the most politically and religiously turbulent periods in Egyptian history. This was the era of the Amarna period, the time of the so-called heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, who abandoned the traditional polytheistic religion of Egypt in favor of the worship of a single deity, the Aten, the disk of the sun. Akhenaten moved the capital of Egypt from Thebes to a newly built city in Middle Egypt called Akhetaten, modern Tel el Amarna, and he sought to erase the names and images of the old gods from the temples and monuments of the land. The Amarna period lasted only about 17 years, from roughly 1353 to 1336 BCE, and it ended in chaos. Akhenaten's successors, including the boy King Tutankhamun, reversed his religious reforms, restored the old gods, and attempted to erase all traces of the Amarna revolution from history. The city of Akhetaten was abandoned and eventually dismantled. Akhenaten's name was removed from the king lists. His monuments were torn down or buried. And for nearly 3,000 years, his very existence was forgotten, until the discovery of Tel el Amarna in the 19th century brought him and his revolution back into the light. The city discovered near Buto added a new dimension to our understanding of this tumultuous period. Among the artifacts recovered from the site was a wine jug bearing an inscription that linked it to Princess Meritaten, the eldest daughter of Akhenaten and his famous wife, Nefertiti. Meritaten is a shadowy figure in Egyptian history, known primarily from the art and inscriptions of her father's reign. She was depicted in family scenes at Amarna, shown worshipping the Aten alongside her parents and sisters. She may have served as her father's great royal wife after the death or disgrace of Nefertiti, though this is debated. And she may have played a role in the chaotic succession that followed Akhenaten's death, possibly ruling briefly as pharaoh under the name Nefer-Neferuin, though this identification is controversial and not universally accepted. The discovery of a wine jug linked to Meritaten at a delta site far from Amarna raised immediate questions. What was this object doing here? Had Meritaten visited this city? Had she lived here? Had the jug been traded, gifted, or discarded? And what did its presence at this site tell us about the political geography of the late 18th dynasty? The answers to these questions remain tentative, but the discovery has encouraged scholars to reconsider the conventional narrative of the Amarna period, which has tended to focus exclusively on the city of Akhetaten and its immediate environs. The find at Buto suggests that the reach of the Amarna royal family extended further than previously thought, and that the political and economic networks of the period were more complex and more geographically dispersed than the textual sources alone would suggest. The city itself also yielded a wealth of other artifacts, including pottery, jewelry, stone vessels, and architectural fragments, that painted a vivid picture of life in the Delta during the late New Kingdom. There were objects of Egyptian manufacture alongside imports from the Aegean, the Levant, and Nubia, confirming the Delta's role as a crossroads of international trade. There were remains of workshops where craftsmen worked in metal, faience, glass, and stone. And there were fragments of inscriptions and administrative texts that hinted at the city's role as an administrative center, a place where taxes were collected, goods were stored, and the business of government was conducted. The most poignant aspect of the discovery, perhaps, was what it revealed about the fate of the city itself. At some point in the late New Kingdom or early Third Intermediate period, the city was abandoned. Its buildings fell into ruin, sand and silt accumulated over its remains, and eventually, centuries later, a new settlement was built on top of the old one by people who had no knowledge of what lay beneath their feet. This pattern of burial and rediscovery is one of the recurring themes of archaeology. The ancient world is layered, with the remains of earlier civilizations lying hidden beneath the foundations of later ones. Every city built on the site of an older city is standing on top of history, and every excavation that penetrates below the current surface has the potential to reveal a world that has been hidden and forgotten. The city near Buto was one such hidden world, and its discovery reminded us that the Nile Delta, despite its challenging conditions and its relative neglect by archaeologists, is one of the richest and most promising areas for future discovery in all of Egypt. The delta was the economic heartland of ancient Egypt, the breadbasket that produced the grain that fed the population and the surplus that funded the construction of temples and pyramids. It was the gateway through which Egypt engaged with the wider Mediterranean world, and it is still largely unexplored. We began this journey beneath the sands of Giza, peering into hidden chambers that no modern eye has seen. We traveled to the tombs of ancient China, where a noblewoman lay preserved for more than 2,000 years in a marvel of ancient engineering. We traced the painstaking decipherment of the hieroglyphs, which gave voice to a civilization that had been silent for more than a millennium. We pondered the undeciphered symbols of the Phaistos disk and the ancient footprints of Litali. We examined the mechanical ingenuity of the Hathor statue and the breathtaking craftsmanship of Egyptian royal barges. We followed the fortified highway across the Sinai Desert and uncovered a forgotten city in the Nile Delta. And yet, we have barely begun. The ancient world is vast, and its secrets are far from exhausted. In the next part of our journey, we will delve deeper into the mysteries that remain. We will explore the legendary vaults of one of the wealthiest temples on Earth, where treasures of incalculable value have been sealed behind locked doors for centuries. We will examine the ongoing debates about what lies beneath the Sphinx and why the Egyptian authorities have been reluctant to explore it. We will investigate the engineering achievements of the ancient Egyptians in greater detail, examining how they moved stones weighing dozens of tons across hundreds of kilometers of desert and lifted them to heights that would challenge modern cranes. And we will encounter more forgotten cities, more hidden chambers, and more artifacts that challenge our understanding of the past. The ground beneath our feet is not empty, it is full. Full of history, full of mystery, full of the traces of the millions of human beings who lived and died and built and created in the millennia before us. Every shovel of earth turned, every core sample drilled, every radar pulse sent into the ground has the potential to reveal something new, something unexpected, something that changes the way we see the world. The ancient world is not dead. It is merely sleeping, waiting for us to wake it up, and we are only getting started. The treasures beneath the earth do not give up their secrets willingly. They must be coaxed, teased, and sometimes wrestled into the light, and the process of doing so often takes decades of patient work by teams of researchers whose names never appear in headlines and whose contributions are known only to their colleagues in the field. Consider, for a moment, the sheer logistics of an archaeological excavation in a place like the Nile Delta. The water table in much of the delta is less than a meter below the surface. Any excavation deeper than this immediately fills with water, turning the dig site into a muddy pool that must be continuously pumped to keep it dry enough to work in. The soil is a thick, dense clay that clings to tools and artifacts alike, making it difficult to distinguish between natural formations and human-made structures. The heat is oppressive, often exceeding 40 degrees Celsius in summer, and the humidity, fed by the delta's network of irrigation canals and rice paddies, makes physical labor exhausting. And yet, it is in this challenging environment that some of the most important discoveries in Egyptian archaeology have been made and continue to be made. The delta sites may lack the dramatic visual appeal of the desert monuments, but they contain information that is essential to our understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization, information about agriculture, trade, industry, urbanization, and daily life that cannot be obtained from the temples and tombs of Upper Egypt. The study of ancient trade networks, for instance, has been revolutionized by the analysis of pottery found at delta sites. Pottery is one of the most ubiquitous and durable artifacts produced by human societies, and it is also one of the most informative. The shape, size, fabric, and decoration of a pot can tell a trained ceramicist where it was made, when it was made, and what it was used for. And because pottery was often traded over long distances, its presence at a site can provide evidence of trade connections that extend hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. At the city near Buto, archaeologists found pottery that had originated in Crete, Cyprus, the Levant, and Nubia, in addition to locally produced Egyptian wares. This diversity of pottery types confirmed that the city was a node in an international trade network that linked Egypt to the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. The Cretan pottery in particular was significant because it demonstrated that trade between Egypt and the Minoan civilization of Crete was continuing even during the turbulent Amarna period, when one might have expected international trade to be disrupted by political instability. The wine jug linked to Princess Meritaten was itself a remarkable artifact, not just for its royal association, but for what it revealed about the wine trade of the late 18th dynasty. The jug bore an inscription that identified its contents as wine from a specific vineyard, a detail that reflects the sophisticated system of wine labeling and quality control that the ancient Egyptians had developed. Egyptian wine jars from this period routinely bear labels that record the vintage year, the name of the vineyard, the name of the vintner, and an assessment of the wine's quality. This level of detail is comparable to modern wine labeling and suggests that the Egyptian elite were discerning consumers who cared about the provenance and quality of what they drank. The presence of such a jar at the Delta site raised the possibility that the city had been involved in the wine trade, either as a production center or as a distribution point for wines produced elsewhere in the Delta. The Delta was one of the major wine-producing regions of ancient Egypt, and the marshes and wetlands of the northern Delta were particularly well suited to viticulture. The city near Buto may have served as a collection and distribution center for wines produced in the surrounding region, funneling them into the trade networks that carried Egyptian goods to the wider world. These are not dramatic discoveries in the way that a sealed tomb or a hidden chamber is dramatic. They do not lend themselves to breathless headlines or sensational documentaries, but they are, in their own way, equally important because they fill in the texture of ancient life, the everyday details that make the past come alive and that transform abstract historical narratives into stories about real people living real lives. The workers at the fortress of Tijaru in the Sinai drank beer brewed from barley grown in the Delta. The wine they occasionally enjoyed came from vineyards tended by peasant farmers whose names are lost to history. The copper tools they used were smelted from ore mined in the mountains of the Sinai by workers who labored in conditions of extreme heat and danger. The linen they wore was woven from flax harvested along the banks of the Nile. The bread they ate was ground from grain stored in the massive granaries of the fortress, grain that had been counted, recorded, and taxed by a bureaucratic apparatus of impressive efficiency. Every artifact recovered from an archaeological site is a point of connection to this web of production, distribution, and consumption. Every potsherd, every flint flake, every seed, every bone fragment tells a story, and the cumulative effect of thousands of such stories is a picture of the ancient world that is richer, more detailed, and more human than anything that the great monuments alone could provide. This is the real power of archaeology. It is not just about discovering spectacular treasures, though such discoveries capture the public imagination and provide the funding that makes continued research possible. It is about reconstructing the totality of human experience in the past, from the grandest achievements of kings and empires to the most humble routines of daily life. It is about understanding not just what the ancient people built, but how they lived, what they ate, what they wore, what they believed, what they feared, and what they hoped for. And it is about recognizing that the past is not a foreign country, inaccessible and incomprehensible. It is our country. It is the country we all come from, the place where all of our stories begin. The people who built the pyramids, who sailed the Nile, who carved the Sphinx, who walked across the volcanic ash at Litali 3.5 million years ago, these were not aliens or demigods or mythical figures. They were human beings, as real and as complex as we are, and they deserve to be remembered not as abstractions but as people. This is what the discoveries we have been discussing make possible. Each hidden chamber, each preserved body, each deciphered text, each forgotten city brought back into the light adds another piece to the puzzle of who we are and where we come from. And the puzzle is far from complete. The earth still holds its secrets. The sand still covers its treasures. And the work of discovery continues, one careful brushstroke at a time, one grain of sand at a time, one question at a time. We are archaeologists of our own past, all of us, and the dig is never finished. Somewhere in the southernmost tip of the Indian subcontinent, behind walls of granite and iron, behind doors that have not been opened in living memory, behind locks that no key in existence can turn, there lies a treasure so vast, so ancient, and so enigmatic that even the most conservative estimates of its value strain credulity. It is not buried beneath the desert. It is not hidden in a collapsed tomb or a sunken ship. It is sitting in plain sight, locked inside the underground vaults of a Hindu temple that has stood on the same spot for more than 1,000 years, guarded by tradition, by faith, and by a profound and abiding fear of what might happen if certain doors are ever opened. The Sri Padmanabhaswamy Temple stands in the city of Tiruvananthapuram, the capital of the Indian state of Kerala, and it is dedicated to Lord Vishnu, one of the principal deities of the Hindu pantheon. The temple's origins are lost in the mists of antiquity. Local tradition holds that it was established thousands of years ago, and the earliest historical references to it date to at least the 6th century CE. The current structure, with its towering gopuram, its ornate stone carvings, and its sacred tank, dates primarily to the 16th and 18th centuries, though it incorporates elements that are considerably older. For centuries, the temple was under the patronage of the Travancore royal family, the hereditary rulers of the Kingdom of Travancore, who considered themselves servants of Lord Padmanabha, the reclining form of Vishnu enshrined in the temple's sanctum. The kings of Travancore did not merely support the temple, they dedicated their kingdom to it. In 1750, King Martanda Varma formally surrendered his kingdom to Lord Padmanabha and declared that henceforth, the kings of Travancore would rule only as regents of the deity. The kingdom's treasury, its revenues, its lands, and its accumulated wealth all belonged, in principle, to the god. This arrangement meant that over the centuries, a staggering quantity of wealth accumulated within the temple's vaults. Gold, silver, precious gems, jewelry, coins, ceremonial objects, and artifacts of every description were offered to the deity by generations of kings, nobles, merchants, and pilgrims, and they were stored in a series of underground chambers beneath the temple. Designated by the letters A through F, the existence of these vaults was widely known, but their contents were a matter of rumor and speculation. No comprehensive inventory had ever been conducted, and access to the vaults was restricted to a small number of temple officials and members of the royal family. The vaults were protected not only by physical locks and barriers, but also by religious prohibitions and a deep-seated belief that disturbing the deity's treasure would bring catastrophic misfortune. In 2011, following a legal dispute that reached the Supreme Court of India, a court-appointed committee was authorized to open and inventory several of the vaults. What they found exceeded all expectations. Vault A alone contained treasures valued at an estimated several $billion. There were gold coins from the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the medieval kingdoms of India. There were necklaces, bracelets, and crowns studded with diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and sapphires of extraordinary size and quality. There were solid gold idols, some standing several feet tall. There were ceremonial swords with jeweled hilts. There were gold chains so long and heavy that they required multiple people to lift them. There were sacks upon sacks of loose gemstones, sorted by type and quality, representing centuries of accumulation. The sheer volume of the treasure was overwhelming. It took the committee days to catalog even a fraction of what was stored in the vaults they opened, and the total value of the accessible contents was estimated at the time to be in excess of $20 billion, making the Sri Padmanabhaswamy Temple the wealthiest religious institution on earth, and perhaps the single largest accumulation of privately held treasure anywhere in the world. But it was Vault B that captured the imagination of the world, because Vault B was not opened. Unlike the other vaults, which were secured with conventional locks, Vault B was sealed with an iron door that bore no visible lock or keyhole. According to temple tradition, the vault had not been opened for at least a century, and some accounts suggested that it had been sealed for much longer, possibly for several centuries. Local lore held that the vault was protected by supernatural forces, that serpent deities guarded its contents, and that opening it without the proper rituals would unleash catastrophe upon the temple, the city, and perhaps the entire region. The Supreme Court, citing concerns about safety, security, and religious sentiment, declined to order the opening of Vault B, and it remains sealed to this day. What it contains is unknown. Estimates based on the contents of the other vaults and on historical records of offerings made to the temple range from modest to almost inconceivable. Some observers have speculated that Vault B could contain treasures that would dwarf the contents of all the other vaults combined, pushing the total value of the temple's holdings into the hundreds of billions of dollars. Others have suggested that the vault may contain artifacts of historical significance that transcend mere monetary value. The temple has connections to maritime trade networks that span the Indian Ocean for millennia, and it is possible that the vault contains objects from distant lands, items brought to Kerala by traders from Rome, Arabia, China, Southeast Asia, and East Africa, that would illuminate the history of Indian Ocean commerce in ways that no existing source can match. Still others have cautioned against extravagant speculation, noting that vaults that have been sealed for long periods often contain less than legends would suggest, and that the mystery of Vault B may ultimately prove to be more interesting than its contents. Whatever lies behind the iron door of Vault B, the story of the Sri Padmanabhaswamy Temple treasure is a powerful reminder of the enduring human impulse to accumulate, to preserve, and to protect objects of value, and of the complex relationship between material wealth and spiritual belief that has characterized human civilization from its earliest days. The treasures of the temple were not hoarded for their own sake. They were offerings to a god, expressions of devotion and gratitude, symbols of the bond between the human and the divine. Every gold coin, every gemstone, every jeweled crown represented not just wealth but faith, the faith of the individual who made the offering and the faith of the community that maintained and protected the temple over the centuries. This intersection of wealth and worship is not unique to the Hindu tradition. It is found in every major religious tradition on earth. The treasuries of medieval European cathedrals, the offerings buried in Mesoamerican cenotes, the gold and silver vessels of the Jerusalem temple, the precious objects interred in Egyptian tombs, all of these represent the same fundamental human behavior, the dedication of material resources to the service of the sacred. And it is worth noting that many of the greatest archaeological discoveries in history have involved the recovery of objects that were originally placed in sacred contexts. Tomb of Tutankhamun, the richest royal burial ever found in Egypt, was filled with objects that were intended to accompany the young pharaoh into the afterlife and to equip him for his existence in the realm of the gods. The terracotta army of Qin Shi Huang was buried to protect the first emperor of China in his posthumous kingdom. The Sutton Hoo ship burial in England contained the grave goods of an Anglo-Saxon king, placed with him to honor his memory and to ensure his status in the afterworld. In each of these cases, the objects were not meant to be seen by living eyes. They were meant to be hidden, sealed, and forgotten, sacrificed to the darkness in the service of beliefs that transcended the material world. And in each case, the passage of time, the accidents of history, and the curiosity of later generations brought them back into the light, transforming sacred offerings into archaeological treasures and objects of public fascination. The Sri Padmanabhaswamy Temple treasure occupies a unique position in this continuum because it has not yet completed the transition from sacred offering to archaeological artifact. The treasures in the open vaults have been catalogued and photographed, but they remain the property of the deity, under the stewardship of the Temple Trust and the descendants of the Travancore royal family. They have not been removed from the temple. They have not been placed in a museum. They remain, as they have always been, offerings to Lord Padmanabha, stored in the darkness beneath his temple, awaiting whatever purpose the god may have for them. And Vault B remains sealed, its iron door unmoved, its contents unknown, its secrets preserved by a combination of physical barriers, legal restrictions, and the weight of tradition. Some mysteries, it seems, are not yet ready to be solved. We return now to the sands of Egypt, to the monument that has inspired more speculation, more debate, and more outright fantasy than any other structure on Earth, the Great Sphinx of Giza. We discussed the Sphinx earlier, noting the anomalies detected beneath its body by ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies. Now let us examine this mystery in greater depth, because the question of what lies beneath the Sphinx is not merely an archaeological curiosity. It is a question that touches on some of the deepest and most contentious debates in the study of the ancient world. The Sphinx sits in a depression in the Giza Plateau, carved from a natural outcrop of limestone that was left standing when the surrounding rock was quarried for use in the construction of the pyramids. The limestone of the Sphinx enclosure is not uniform. It consists of several distinct layers or members of varying hardness, and this variation in hardness is responsible for much of the Sphinx's current appearance. The harder layers have resisted erosion and protrude outward, while the softer layers have weathered away, creating the deeply recessed horizontal bands that give the Sphinx its characteristic weathered look. The head of the Sphinx is carved from a harder layer of limestone than the body, which explains why the head is relatively well preserved while the body is heavily eroded. The head may also have been recarved at some point in antiquity, which would explain its relatively small size in proportion to the body. Some researchers have suggested that the original head may have been that of a lion, matching the leonine body, and that it was later recarved into a human likeness, possibly during the 4th dynasty. This hypothesis would explain the proportional discrepancy, since carving a human head from an existing lion head would inevitably produce a smaller result. But the question that has generated the most intense debate is not about the Sphinx's head. It is about what lies beneath its paws and beneath its body. The remote sensing surveys conducted in the 1990s by multiple independent teams consistently identified anomalies beneath the Sphinx that were consistent with the presence of voids or cavities. The most prominent of these anomalies was located beneath the left paw at a depth of approximately 5 meters. It appeared to be a roughly rectangular cavity, approximately 9 meters long and 5 meters wide, with a regular shape that suggested artificial construction rather than natural geological formation. Additional anomalies were detected beneath the body of the Sphinx, along its flanks, and in the bedrock between the Sphinx and the neighboring temples. Some of these anomalies were consistent with natural features of the limestone, such as solution cavities or fracture zones, but others had shapes and dimensions that were difficult to explain by natural processes alone. The researchers who conducted these surveys were cautious in their conclusions. They noted that remote sensing can detect the presence of voids but cannot determine their contents or their origin. A void might be an empty natural cavity, a water-filled fissure, a layer of unusually soft rock, or an artificial chamber. Without direct physical access, it is impossible to distinguish between these possibilities. But the researchers also noted that some of the anomalies had characteristics that were strongly suggestive of artificial construction. The anomaly beneath the left paw in particular had a shape and size that were difficult to reconcile with any known natural process, and its location, directly beneath the most symbolically significant part of the Sphinx, was suggestive of deliberate placement. The idea that chambers might exist beneath the Sphinx has been a source of fascination and controversy for decades. As we noted earlier, the concept of a hall of records beneath the Sphinx has been a fixture of popular culture since the early 20th century, and it has attracted the attention of everyone from serious researchers to New Age enthusiasts to outright charlatans. This association with fringe theories and pseudoscience has made mainstream Egyptologists reluctant to engage with the question, for fear of lending credibility to claims that they regard as baseless. This reluctance is understandable, but it has also had the unfortunate effect of suppressing legitimate scientific inquiry. The remote sensing data is real, the anomalies are real, and the question of what they represent is a legitimate scientific question that deserves a legitimate scientific answer. The fact that the question has been co-opted by conspiracy theorists and self-appointed prophets does not make it any less valid. The Egyptian authorities have their own reasons for caution. The Sphinx is a fragile monument that has been the subject of extensive and expensive conservation efforts over the past several decades. The limestone from which it is carved is soft and porous, and it is vulnerable to damage from water, salt crystallization, wind erosion, and pollution. Any excavation beneath or around the Sphinx would carry significant risks to the monument's structural integrity, and the authorities have understandably been reluctant to authorize work that could damage one of Egypt's most iconic and economically important cultural assets. There is also a political dimension to the question. The Sphinx is not merely an archaeological monument. It is a symbol of Egyptian national identity, a source of national pride, and a major tourist attraction that generates significant revenue for the Egyptian economy. The Egyptian authorities are protective of their cultural heritage, and they are wary of foreign researchers who may have agendas that do not align with Egyptian interests. The history of Egyptology is, after all, a history of colonial-era appropriation, in which European and other foreign researchers removed vast quantities of artifacts from Egypt, often with little regard for Egyptian sovereignty or Egyptian sensibilities. The Egyptian authorities' caution about allowing foreign researchers to excavate beneath the Sphinx must be understood in this context, but the anomalies remain, and the question remains, what is down there? One possible approach to resolving the question without physical excavation would be to conduct more extensive and more sophisticated remote sensing surveys using the latest technologies. Since the surveys of the 1990s, remote sensing technology has advanced considerably. Modern ground-penetrating radar systems offer higher resolution, greater depth penetration, and more sophisticated data processing capabilities than their predecessors. Muon tomography, which has proven its value in the study of the Great Pyramid, could potentially be applied to the Sphinx as well. And emerging technologies such as ambient noise tomography, which uses the background vibrations of the Earth itself to map subsurface structures, could provide additional data. A comprehensive, multi-method remote sensing survey of the Sphinx and its immediate surroundings, conducted by a team of international experts with the full cooperation and oversight of the Egyptian authorities, could potentially resolve the question of whether the anomalies represent natural geological features or artificial chambers. Such a survey would be non-invasive, posing no risk to the monument, and it would provide data of lasting scientific value regardless of its conclusions. Whether such a survey will ever be conducted remains to be seen. The political, cultural, and scientific complexities of the question are formidable, and they are unlikely to be resolved quickly. But the question itself will not go away. As long as the anomalies persist in the data, as long as the Sphinx sits silently on the Giza Plateau, its secrets intact, the question will continue to haunt the imagination of scholars and laypeople alike. What lies beneath the Sphinx, we do not know. But the question is one of the most compelling in all of archaeology, and the answer, when it finally comes, may change our understanding of the ancient world in ways we cannot yet imagine. While the mysteries beneath the Sphinx await resolution, other discoveries are actively reshaping our understanding of the ancient Egyptians' capabilities, particularly in the realm of engineering. We touched briefly on the mechanical Hathor statue at Dendera and the magnificent boats of the Nile, but these represent only a fraction of the engineering achievements that the Egyptians accomplished over the course of their 3,000-year civilization. To truly appreciate the scale and sophistication of Egyptian engineering, one must consider not just what they built, but how they built it. The construction of a monument like the Great Pyramid was not simply a matter of stacking blocks. It was an organizational, logistical, and technical challenge of staggering complexity, requiring the coordination of tens of thousands of workers, the management of vast quantities of materials, the solution of intricate mathematical and geometric problems, and the application of engineering principles that, in some cases, anticipated developments that would not be formally codified for millennia. Let us begin with the most basic question: how did the ancient Egyptians quarry the stone? The bulk of the Great Pyramid is constructed from nummulitic limestone, a relatively soft sedimentary rock that could be quarried using copper tools, wooden wedges, and human muscle. The quarries from which this limestone was extracted are located on the Giza Plateau itself, just a few hundred meters south of the pyramid, and the scars left by the ancient quarrying operations are still visible today. The quarrymen used copper chisels and stone hammers to cut channels in the rock, defining the outline of each block. They then inserted wooden wedges into the channels and soaked the wedges with water. As the wood absorbed the water and expanded, it exerted enormous pressure on the rock, splitting it along the desired lines. This technique, known as wedge and water splitting, is simple in principle but requires considerable skill and practice. The quarrymen had to choose the placement of their wedges carefully, taking into account the natural grain and fracture planes of the rock, to ensure that the block split cleanly and did not shatter. A single misplaced wedge could ruin hours of work and produce an unusable block. The softer limestone used for the interior of the pyramid could be quarried relatively quickly, but the fine white limestone used for the outer casing was a different matter. This stone came from quarries at Tura, on the east bank of the Nile, about 15 kilometers south of Giza. Tura limestone is harder, denser, and more uniform in texture than the local Giza limestone, and it could be polished to a smooth, gleaming finish. It was this casing of polished white limestone that gave the Great Pyramid its original appearance, a perfectly smooth, dazzlingly bright surface that reflected the sunlight and could be seen from miles away. Transporting the Tura limestone from the east bank of the Nile to the west bank and then to the Giza Plateau required a logistical infrastructure of impressive sophistication. The blocks were loaded onto boats and ferried across the river during the annual inundation, when the floodwaters raised the river level and extended navigable waterways closer to the construction site. On the west bank, the blocks were unloaded at purpose-built harbors and transported overland to the plateau, probably on wooden sledges lubricated with water, which reduced friction and made it possible for teams of men to drag the heavy blocks over the desert surface. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence of this logistical infrastructure, including the remains of a harbor complex at the foot of the Giza Plateau, complete with docking facilities, workshops, and administrative buildings. Papyri discovered at the site, known as the Diary of Murrer, record the day-by-day activities of a work crew involved in transporting limestone from Tura to Giza. These papyri, dating to the reign of Khufu himself, provide the closest thing we have to a first-hand account of the pyramid's construction, and they confirm that the operation was managed with bureaucratic precision, with work schedules, ration distributions, and boat assignments all carefully recorded and filed. But the most impressive feat of quarrying and transportation associated with the Great Pyramid involved not the limestone but the granite. The king's chamber, deep inside the pyramid, is constructed entirely of red granite, a much harder and heavier stone than limestone. The granite came from quarries at Aswan, more than 800 kilometers to the south, and it was transported to Giza by river, a journey of several weeks against the current. The granite beams that form the ceiling of the king's chamber and the relieving chambers above it are among the largest single blocks used anywhere in the pyramid. The largest of these beams weighs approximately 80 tons. Quarrying, shaping, transporting, and lifting such massive blocks was a tremendous technical achievement, and it is worth pausing to consider the challenges involved. Granite is an igneous rock, far harder than limestone, and it cannot be effectively worked with copper tools. The ancient Egyptian quarrymen used a technique known as pounding, in which balls of dolerite, an even harder igneous rock, were used to batter the granite surface, pulverizing it grain by grain. This process was extremely slow and labor-intensive. Experimental archaeology has shown that a team of workers pounding with dolerite balls can remove only a few centimeters of granite per day. Quarrying a single large block would have taken weeks or even months of continuous pounding. Once quarried, the granite blocks had to be transported to the river, loaded onto boats, shipped downstream to Giza, unloaded, transported to the construction site, and lifted into position inside the pyramid. The logistics of this operation are mind-boggling. An 80-ton block would have required a boat large enough to carry it without capsizing, a crew skilled enough to navigate the river with such a heavy cargo, and a system of ramps, levers, and rollers capable of moving the block from the riverbank to the pyramid and then lifting it to the required height. The exact methods used by the Egyptians to accomplish these feats remain the subject of debate. As we noted earlier, various theories have been proposed, including external ramps, internal ramps, and systems of levers and counterweights. Each theory has its strengths and weaknesses, and it is possible that the Egyptians used a combination of methods, adapting their techniques to the specific challenges of each stage of construction. What is not in doubt is that they succeeded. The king's chamber exists. The granite beams are in place. They have remained in place for more than 4,500 years, bearing the weight of hundreds of thousands of tons of stone above them without cracking, shifting, or settling. This is a testament not only to the Egyptians' ability to quarry and transport massive blocks of stone, but also to their understanding of structural engineering and their ability to design structures that would endure for millennia. The precision of Egyptian engineering is equally impressive on a small scale. Consider the joints between the casing stones of the Great Pyramid. Although most of the original casing has been stripped away over the centuries, used as building material for the mosques and palaces of medieval Cairo, a few courses of casing stones remain in place at the base of the pyramid, and they display a level of craftsmanship that borders on the unbelievable. The joints between these stones are so fine that the gap between adjacent blocks is less than half a millimeter, thinner than a sheet of paper. The surfaces of the blocks are so flat that they vary by less than a tenth of a millimeter over their entire length. This level of precision was achieved without power tools, without laser levels, without computer-aided design, using only hand tools, the naked eye, and an understanding of geometry and measurement that was, for its time, without equal in the world. How did they do it? The most likely explanation is that the Egyptians used a combination of careful measurement, skillful stonework, and a technique known as rubbing. After rough cutting a casing stone to approximate dimensions, the masons would place it against its neighbor and rub the two surfaces together, grinding away the high points until the surfaces mated perfectly. This process, though time-consuming, is capable of producing extraordinarily flat and smooth surfaces, and it has been used by stonemasons and machinists throughout history. But the precision of the casing stones is just one example of the Egyptians' mastery of measurement and geometry. The base of the Great Pyramid, as we noted earlier, is level to within 2 centimeters across its entire area. The sides are aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a degree. The 4 sides of the base are nearly identical in length, differing by less than 5 centimeters, a variance of less than 0.04%. Achieving this level of precision over such a large area required a sophisticated understanding of surveying and a system of measurement that was both accurate and consistent. The Egyptians are known to have used a unit of measurement called the royal cubit, approximately 52.4 centimeters, divided into 7 palms of 4 fingers each, giving a total of 28 digits per cubit. Physical examples of cubit rods have been found in Egyptian tombs, and they are remarkably consistent, suggesting that the Egyptians maintained a system of standardization that ensured uniformity across large construction projects. For leveling, the Egyptians probably used a technique based on water. By digging a network of shallow channels across the construction site and filling them with water, they could create a perfectly level reference plane, since water always seeks its own level. The heights of the channel walls above the water surface could then be measured and used to establish a level baseline for the construction. For alignment to true north, the Egyptians may have used a technique based on stellar observation. By observing the rising and setting positions of a circumpolar star and bisecting the angle between these two positions, they could determine true north with considerable accuracy. This technique, known as the simultaneous transit method, has been demonstrated experimentally to produce alignments that match the precision observed at the Great Pyramid. These are not speculative reconstructions. They are based on physical evidence, experimental archaeology, and a detailed understanding of the tools and techniques available to the Egyptians. And they reveal a civilization that, while it lacked many of the technologies that we take for granted, including the wheel for transportation, iron tools, and the pulley in its earliest periods, possessed a depth of practical knowledge and a level of technical skill that enabled it to accomplish feats of construction that would challenge modern engineers working with modern equipment. The Great Pyramid is the most famous example of Egyptian engineering, but it is far from the only one. The temples of Karnak and Luxor, with their forests of massive columns and their intricately carved walls, represent engineering achievements of a different kind, focused not on sheer mass but on architectural sophistication and artistic refinement. The rock-cut temples of Abu Simbel, carved into the living cliff face on the banks of the Nile in Nubia, demonstrate the Egyptians' mastery of large-scale sculptural engineering. The obelisks of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, some of which weigh more than 300 tons and stand more than 30 meters tall, are triumphs of quarrying, transportation, and erection that have never been fully explained. And the engineering achievements of the ancient Egyptians were not limited to monumental construction. They also developed sophisticated systems of irrigation, water management, and agricultural engineering that enabled them to transform the Nile Valley from a seasonal floodplain into one of the most productive agricultural landscapes in the ancient world. They built canal systems that diverted floodwaters into storage basins, where the water could be held and released as needed during the growing season. They developed the shaduf, a counterweighted lever used to lift water from the river into irrigation channels, and they later adopted the sakia, a water wheel powered by animal traction that could raise water to greater heights and in greater volumes. These agricultural technologies were not glamorous, and they rarely feature in popular accounts of ancient Egypt, but they were arguably more important than the pyramids and temples, because they were the foundation upon which the entire civilization rested. Without the ability to produce agricultural surplus, there would have been no surplus labor to build monuments, no surplus wealth to fund the temples and the priesthood, no surplus food to feed the armies that defended the borders and projected Egyptian power into neighboring lands. The pyramids were built on bread, and the bread was grown with water that was managed, controlled, and distributed by an engineering infrastructure of remarkable sophistication. The engineering achievements of the ancient Egyptians extended beyond the physical world and into realms that we might today classify as applied science. One of the most fascinating examples of this is the Egyptian approach to medicine, which combined empirical observation, rational analysis, and magical thinking in ways that are both familiar and alien to modern sensibilities. The principal sources for our knowledge of ancient Egyptian medicine are a series of papyri that have survived from various periods of Egyptian history. The most important of these are the Edwin Smith Papyrus, the Ebers Papyrus, the Kahun Papyrus, and the London Medical Papyrus. Together, these documents provide a detailed picture of Egyptian medical theory and practice, covering topics that range from surgery and orthopedics to gynecology, pharmacology, and the treatment of infectious diseases. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dating to approximately 1600 BCE but believed to be a copy of an older text from the Old Kingdom, is the earliest known surgical treatise. It describes 48 cases of injuries and ailments arranged in a systematic order from head to foot, and for each case it provides a description of the symptoms, a diagnosis, a prognosis, and where applicable, a recommended treatment. The cases are classified into three categories: conditions that the physician can treat, conditions that the physician can contend with, and conditions that are untreatable. The approach is strikingly rational and empirical. The Edwin Smith Papyrus does not attribute injuries to the wrath of gods or the malice of demons. It describes them in purely physical terms as the results of falls, blows, and other traumatic events, and it recommends treatments that are based on observation and experience. For a fractured skull, for example, the papyrus recommends immobilization, cold compresses, and careful observation for signs of brain damage. For a dislocated jaw, it describes a manual reduction technique that is remarkably similar to the technique used by modern emergency physicians. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to approximately 1550 BCE, is a more eclectic document, covering a wider range of conditions and treatments. It includes remedies for ailments ranging from headaches and digestive problems to skin diseases and dental decay. Some of the remedies are based on ingredients that modern pharmacology has confirmed to have therapeutic properties. Honey, for example, which is frequently prescribed in the Ebers Papyrus, is now known to have antimicrobial properties. Willow bark, another common ingredient, contains salicin, a compound closely related to aspirin. Moldy bread, which was sometimes applied to infected wounds, may have provided a crude form of antibiotic therapy, anticipating the discovery of penicillin by more than 3,000 years. Other remedies in the Ebers papyrus are less scientifically sound, involving ingredients such as crocodile dung, fly droppings, and various animal organs whose therapeutic value is, to put it charitably, questionable. And the papyrus also includes magical incantations and spells that were to be recited alongside the administration of physical remedies, reflecting the Egyptian belief that illness could have both natural and supernatural causes, and that effective treatment required addressing both dimensions. This combination of rational empiricism and magical thinking may seem contradictory to modern minds, but it made perfect sense within the Egyptian worldview. The Egyptians did not draw a sharp distinction between the natural and the supernatural, the physical and the spiritual, the scientific and the magical. For them, these categories were not separate and opposed, but intertwined and complementary. A disease might have a physical cause, such as an injury or a dietary imbalance, and a supernatural cause, such as the anger of a god or the curse of an enemy, simultaneously. Effective treatment required addressing both causes, using physical remedies for the physical dimension and magical rituals for the supernatural dimension. This integrated approach to medicine was reflected in the organization of the medical profession itself. Egyptian physicians were often also priests, trained not only in the practical arts of diagnosis and treatment, but also in the ritual arts of invocation and purification. The distinction between doctor and priest, which seems so clear-cut in the modern world, was blurred or non-existent in ancient Egypt. The sophistication of Egyptian medicine is also evident in the specialized knowledge that Egyptian physicians possessed about human anatomy. The process of mummification, which required the removal and separate preservation of internal organs, gave Egyptian embalmers an intimate familiarity with the interior of the human body. They knew the location and appearance of the heart, the lungs, the liver, the stomach, the intestines, and the kidneys. They understood that the heart was the center of the circulatory system, though they believed it was also the seat of intelligence and emotion, a belief that persisted in Western culture until relatively recent times. The Egyptians also recognized the importance of hygiene in preventing disease. They practiced regular bathing, used natron, a naturally occurring mineral salt, as a cleaning agent, and developed elaborate systems of water purification and waste disposal. The workers' village at Deir el-Medina on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes provides evidence of organized sanitation, with communal latrines, refuse disposal areas, and channels for drainage. These practices were not driven by a germ theory of disease, which would not be developed for another 3 millennia, but by a combination of practical observation and religious purity requirements. The Egyptians noticed that cleanliness reduced the incidence of illness, and they incorporated hygiene into their religious rituals, requiring priests to wash multiple times a day and to maintain strict standards of personal cleanliness. The result was a level of public health that was, by the standards of the ancient world, remarkably advanced. From the practical arts of Egyptian medicine and engineering, let us turn to one of the most intriguing and least understood aspects of ancient Egyptian civilization, its relationship with the wider world. Modern popular culture tends to portray ancient Egypt as an isolated civilization, a solitary oasis of culture and sophistication surrounded by desert and barbarism. This image is profoundly misleading. Ancient Egypt was, from its earliest days, enmeshed in a web of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that connected it to civilizations across the Mediterranean, the Near East, Africa, and beyond. The evidence for these connections is overwhelming. Egyptian artifacts have been found at sites throughout the Mediterranean basin, from Crete and mainland Greece to the Levanten coast and the islands of the Aegean. Conversely, artifacts from these regions have been found in abundance at Egyptian sites, demonstrating that the trade flowed in both directions. Egyptian tomb paintings depict foreign emissaries bearing gifts and tribute, including distinctive products from Crete, Punt, Nubia, and the Levanten kingdoms. The Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence found at Akhenaten's capital, reveal that the pharaoh maintained regular communication with the kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, Hatti, Cyprus, and the Canaanite city-states, exchanging gifts, negotiating treaties, and managing the complex web of alliances and rivalries that characterized the international politics of the Late Bronze Age. The discovery of the forgotten city near Buto, which we discussed in the first part of our journey, provided further evidence of Egypt's international connections. The presence of Cretan, Cypriot, and Levanten pottery at the site confirmed that the Nile Delta was a hub of international trade, a place where goods from across the eastern Mediterranean converged and were redistributed throughout Egypt and beyond. But the most dramatic evidence of Egypt's international connections comes not from the land but from the sea. In 1982, a young underwater archaeologist was diving in the waters off the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, near the modern city of Alexandria, when he made a discovery that would ultimately lead to the identification of one of the most important lost cities of the ancient world. The city was Thonis Heracleion, known to the Egyptians as Thonis and to the Greeks as Heracleion. It was once the greatest port on the Egyptian Mediterranean coast, the gateway through which all seaborne trade between Egypt and the Greek world had to pass. Greek historians, including Herodotus, described it as a bustling, cosmopolitan city, rich in temples, warehouses, and commercial establishments. But after the founding of Alexandria by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, Thonis Heracleion gradually declined in importance, and at some point in the late first millennium BCE or the early centuries of the Common Era, it sank beneath the waves, the victim of a combination of rising sea levels, land subsidence, and catastrophic flooding or earthquakes. For nearly 2 millennia, the city lay forgotten on the seafloor, buried under several meters of sand and silt, its location unknown, its very existence questioned by some scholars who doubted that it had ever been more than a legend. The underwater excavations that began in the late 1990s and continue to this day have revealed a city of extraordinary richness and complexity. The divers have recovered colossal statues of Egyptian gods and goddesses, some standing more than 5 meters tall, that once adorned the city's temples. They have found the remains of more than 60 ancient ships, from small cargo vessels to large warships, lying in the harbor and in the channels that once connected the city to the Nile. They have recovered gold coins, jewelry, pottery, bronze figurines, stone stelae inscribed with hieroglyphic and Greek texts, and a vast array of other artifacts that span more than 1,000 years of occupation. Among the most significant finds was a monumental stele, a large inscribed stone slab that bore a decree issued by the pharaoh Nectanebo I in the 4th century BCE. This decree, which imposed a tax on goods passing through the port of Thonis, confirmed the identification of the site and provided detailed information about the city's economic importance and administrative structure. The city's layout has been mapped using sonar, magnetometry, and systematic diving surveys, revealing a complex urban plan that included a main temple precinct dedicated to the god Amun, a network of canals and waterways that served as the city's streets, residential and commercial districts, and a massive harbor basin that could accommodate dozens of ships simultaneously. The religious significance of Thonis Heracleion was evidently considerable. The Temple of Amun, the city's principal sanctuary, was a major pilgrimage destination, and the city hosted important religious festivals that attracted worshippers from across Egypt and the Greek world. The Greek hero Heracles was said to have visited the city, which is how it acquired its Greek name, and the temple was renowned for its oracle, which was consulted by kings and commoners alike. But it was the city's role as a commercial hub that was its defining characteristic. Thonis Heracleion was the toll booth of the Egyptian coast, the place where every ship entering or leaving Egypt had to stop, submit its cargo for inspection, and pay the requisite taxes and duties. The wealth generated by this trade flowed into the city's temples, its merchant houses, and its treasury, making Thonis Heracleion one of the richest cities in the ancient world. The goods that passed through the city included wine, olive oil, and pottery from Greece, cedar wood, glass, and textiles from the Levant, incense, spices, and precious metals from Arabia and East Africa, papyrus, grain, and linen from the Nile Valley, and a host of other commodities from across the known world. The city was a melting pot, a place where Egyptian, Greek, Phoenician, and other cultures met, mingled, and influenced each other, producing a hybrid culture that was both distinctively Egyptian and distinctively cosmopolitan. The discovery of Thonis Heracleion has transformed our understanding of Egypt's relationship with the Mediterranean world. It has shown that this relationship was not peripheral or incidental but central to the Egyptian economy and to Egyptian cultural life. It has demonstrated that the Nile Delta, far from being a backwater, was one of the most economically dynamic and culturally diverse regions of the ancient world. And it has provided a physical context for the literary and historical references to Egypt's maritime trade that have been known since antiquity, but that, in the absence of archaeological evidence, had remained abstract and difficult to interpret. The excavations at Thonis Heracleion are still ongoing, and new discoveries continue to emerge from the seafloor. Each diving season brings new artifacts, new insights, and new questions. The city has not yet yielded all of its secrets, and it may be decades before the full picture of this extraordinary place is revealed. But even the partial picture that has emerged so far is enough to demonstrate that the ancient world was far more connected, far more cosmopolitan, and far more dynamic than the popular imagination tends to assume. The great civilizations of the ancient world, Egypt, Greece, Phoenicia, Mesopotamia, India, China, did not exist in isolation. They were linked by trade routes, diplomatic networks, and cultural exchanges that spanned thousands of kilometers and crossed every conceivable geographical barrier, from the deserts of North Africa to the mountains of Central Asia to the open waters of the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, and beyond. The lost city beneath the waves near Alexandria was not the only forgotten settlement to emerge from obscurity in recent years. Throughout the Nile Delta and the coastal regions of Egypt, a series of discoveries has revealed a landscape of ancient habitation that is far denser and more complex than anyone had suspected. The city uncovered near Buto, which we discussed earlier in connection with the wine jug of Princess Meritaten, is just one example. Similar discoveries have been made at other delta sites, revealing layers of occupation that extend back thousands of years and that illuminate periods of Egyptian history that are poorly documented in the textual sources. One of the most significant aspects of the Buto discovery was the light it shed on the Amarna period, the 17-year reign of Akhenaten that convulsed Egyptian society and left scars that took generations to heal. The Amarna period remains one of the most intensely studied and fiercely debated episodes in Egyptian history. Akhenaten's decision to abandon the traditional gods of Egypt in favor of the Aten, his construction of a new capital at Akhetaten, his iconoclastic destruction of the images and names of the old gods, and the chaotic succession that followed his death have fascinated and perplexed historians for more than a century. The discovery of artifacts from the Amarna period at a delta site far from Akhetaten added a new dimension to this story. It suggested that the Amarna revolution was not confined to the royal court and the new capital, but had repercussions that extended throughout the length and breadth of Egypt. The wine jug linked to Princess Meritaten, found hundreds of kilometers from Akhetaten, implied that members of the royal family maintained connections and perhaps residences in the delta, and that the political and economic networks of the Amarna period were more extensive than previously thought. The artifacts from the Buto site also included objects that dated to the period immediately following the Amarna revolution, the reigns of Tutankhamun, I, and Horemheb, when the old religious order was being restored and the memory of Akhenaten was being systematically erased. These artifacts provided evidence of the disruption and upheaval that characterized this transitional period, as the apparatus of state struggled to undo the changes of the previous generation and to restore a sense of normalcy and continuity. The story of Meritaten herself is emblematic of the mysteries of the Amarna period. She was the eldest daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, born into a position of extraordinary privilege and power. She appeared prominently in the art of the Amarna period, depicted alongside her parents and sisters in scenes of family life and religious worship. As a teenager, she may have assumed the title of Great Royal Wife after her mother's disappearance from the historical record, though whether Nefertiti died, fell from favor, or assumed a new identity remains one of the great unsolved questions of Egyptian history. After Akhenaten's death, Meritaten's fate becomes uncertain. Some scholars have identified her with the mysterious pharaoh Neferneferuit, who may have ruled briefly during the chaotic transition between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. Others have suggested that she was married to the enigmatic Sphinx, another shadowy figure of the late Amarna period, whose relationship to Akhenaten and whose very identity remain subjects of intense debate. What happened to Meritaten after the fall of the Amarna dynasty? Did she die young, a victim of the plague that may have swept through Egypt during this period? Did she survive into the reign of Tutankhamun or beyond, living in obscurity after the fall of her family from power? Or did she flee Egypt altogether, as some speculative theories have suggested, seeking refuge in a foreign court? The wine jug found at Buto cannot answer these questions definitively, but it adds a small piece to the puzzle. It tells us that objects associated with Meritaten were present at a site in the delta, far from the family's power base at Akhetaten. This could mean many things: that Meritaten visited the delta in person, that goods from her household were traded or redistributed to distant locations, or that the jug was simply a standard-issue wine container from a royal vineyard that happened to bear her name. but the very ambiguity of the evidence is what makes the Amarna period so fascinating. It is a period in which the usual sources of historical information, king lists, monumental inscriptions, commemorative stelae have been deliberately destroyed or suppressed, leaving historians to piece together the narrative from scattered fragments, ambiguous artifacts, and educated guesswork. Every new discovery, no matter how small, has the potential to shift the balance of the evidence and to suggest new interpretations of a story that has captivated historians for more than a century. Throughout our exploration of these archaeological mysteries and discoveries, a recurring theme has emerged: the power of technology to reveal what was previously hidden, to answer questions that were previously unanswerable, and to raise new questions that no one had previously thought to ask. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed hidden structures beneath the Giza Plateau. Muon tomography has identified voids inside the Great Pyramid. Underwater archaeology has brought lost cities back from the depths of the sea. DNA analysis has identified family relationships among royal mummies. Carbon-14 dating has established chronologies for sites and artifacts around the world. Satellite imagery has identified archaeological sites that are invisible from ground level. CT scanning has allowed researchers to examine the interiors of mummies without unwrapping them. Isotopic analysis has determined the geographical origins of ancient materials, and advanced imaging technologies have made it possible to read texts that have been burned, folded, or otherwise damaged beyond the reach of the naked eye. Each of these technologies has opened a new window onto the past, and each has demonstrated that the past contains more than we knew, more than we expected, and more than we can currently comprehend. But technology alone is not enough. Technology provides data, but data must be interpreted, and interpretation requires knowledge, judgment, and imagination. The ground-penetrating radar survey that identified the anomaly near the Great Pyramid produced a mass of raw data that had to be processed, filtered, and analyzed before it could yield meaningful results. The interpretation of that data required expertise in geophysics, archaeology, and Egyptology, and even then the results were ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations, and subject to revision as additional data becomes available. This is the fundamental challenge of archaeology. The evidence is always incomplete, always ambiguous, always open to reinterpretation. Unlike a laboratory experiment, which can be repeated under controlled conditions, an archaeological excavation is a one-time event. Once a site has been dug, it cannot be unexcavated. The relationships between artifacts, soil layers, and architectural features that existed before excavation are destroyed by the act of excavation itself, and they can never be restored. This is why modern archaeology places such enormous emphasis on documentation, recording every detail of the excavation process, from the position of every artifact to the color and texture of every soil layer, so that the information that is destroyed by excavation is preserved in written, photographic, and digital form. It is also why the question of what lies beneath the Sphinx, or beneath the Pyramid of Khafre, or behind the sealed door of Vault B at the Sri Padmanabhaswamy Temple is so tantalizing. These are places where the evidence has not yet been destroyed by excavation, where the original relationships between objects, spaces, and structures are still intact, where the information that the past has to offer is still preserved in its original form, waiting to be read. The decision of whether and when to explore these places is not a simple one. It involves balancing the desire for knowledge against the risk of damage, the interests of the scientific community against the concerns of local communities and national governments, and the urgency of discovery against the patience of preservation. In some cases, the wisest course may be to wait, to allow technology to advance to the point where the evidence can be recovered without destruction, and to ensure that when exploration does occur, it is conducted with the highest standards of scientific rigor and cultural sensitivity. In other cases, the urgency may be greater. Sites that are threatened by development, erosion, looting, or climate change may need to be investigated quickly before the evidence is lost forever. The underwater ruins of Thonis Heracleion, for example, are gradually being eroded by currents and buried by sediment, and the window of opportunity for excavation may not remain open indefinitely. The balance between urgency and patience, between exploration and preservation, is one of the central tensions of modern archaeology, and it plays out differently at every site and in every situation. There is no one-size-fits-all answer. Each case must be judged on its own merits, taking into account the specific conditions and circumstances of the site, the available technology, the potential rewards of exploration, and the potential risks of intervention. As we near the end of our journey through the mysteries and marvels of the ancient world, it is worth stepping back and considering what all of these discoveries, taken together, tell us about the human story. The hidden chambers beneath the Giza Plateau tell us that even the most thoroughly studied sites can yield surprises, that the past is deeper and more complex than we imagined, and that our understanding of the ancient world is still evolving. The preserved body of Lady Di tells us that the human desire to conquer death is universal, transcending time, culture, and geography, and that some ancient peoples possessed a level of technological sophistication that we are only now beginning to appreciate. The decipherment of the hieroglyphs tells us that the barriers between past and present are not impenetrable, that with sufficient ingenuity and persistence, we can reach across millennia and make contact with the minds and hearts of people who lived and died thousands of years ago. The Phaistos disk tells us that some mysteries may never be solved, and that the ancient world contained complexities and subtleties that we may never fully comprehend. The Litali footprints tell us that the story of humanity is unimaginably old, stretching back millions of years into the deep past, and that the impulse to walk upright, to move through the world on 2 feet, is one of the most ancient and defining characteristics of our lineage. The mechanical Hathor statue tells us that ancient technology was more sophisticated and more diverse than we typically assume, and that the boundary between science and religion, which seems so clear-cut in the modern world, was blurred or non-existent in many ancient cultures. The fortified highway across the Sinai tells us that the ancient world was more interconnected, more organized, and more strategically sophisticated than popular culture would have us believe, and that the Egyptians were not merely builders of monuments but also builders of empires, military strategists, and masters of logistics. The lost city beneath the Mediterranean waves tells us that entire civilizations can vanish from human memory, swallowed by the sea or buried by the sand, and that the process of recovery and remembrance is ongoing, with new discoveries emerging every year. The treasures of the Sri Padmanabhaswamy Temple tell us that the human impulse to accumulate and protect objects of value is as ancient as civilization itself, and that the relationship between material wealth and spiritual belief is one of the most enduring and complex themes in human history. And the ongoing debates about the Sphinx, the pyramids, and the countless other unresolved questions of the ancient world tell us that the past is not a closed book. It is an open investigation, a work in progress, a story that is still being written. The ancient world was not a simple place. It was a world of astonishing complexity, diversity, and creativity, a world in which human beings grappled with the same fundamental questions that we grapple with today, questions about mortality and meaning, about power and justice, about the nature of the divine and the purpose of human existence. The monuments and artifacts that survive from this world are not merely objects of aesthetic admiration or academic curiosity. They are messages from the past, communications from our ancestors, attempts to reach across the abyss of time and make contact with the future. And they are still speaking to us if only we have the patience and the wisdom to listen. The story of the ancient world is the story of all of us. It is the story of who we are, where we came from, and what we are capable of achieving. It is a story of triumph and tragedy, of creativity and destruction, of wisdom and folly. It is a story that began millions of years ago on a volcanic plain in Tanzania, where a small group of bipedal creatures left their footprints in the cooling ash, and it continues today in the laboratories and excavation sites and museum storerooms where the evidence of the past is being recovered, analyzed, and interpreted. Every generation adds a new chapter to this story. Every discovery fills in a gap, corrects an error, or opens a new line of inquiry. And every mystery that remains unsolved is an invitation to the future, a challenge to the next generation of archaeologists, historians, scientists, and explorers to take up the work and carry it forward. The ground beneath our feet is full of secrets. The sea holds cities in its depths. The desert hides fortresses beneath its sands. The temples guard their treasures behind locked doors. And the monuments stand silent, waiting for us to ask the right questions. We have come a long way on this journey, from the hidden chambers of Giza to the sealed vaults of Kerala, from the tombs of ancient China to the sunken cities of the Mediterranean, from the volcanic plains of Tanzania to the fortified highways of the Sinai. We have encountered mysteries that have been solved and mysteries that remain unsolved. We have marveled at the ingenuity of the ancient engineers and the dedication of the modern researchers who are bringing their achievements back into the light. But the journey is not over. It will never be over. As long as there are questions to be asked and mysteries to be explored, the work of discovery will continue. The ancient world is still speaking to us in whispers and fragments, in footprints and hieroglyphs, in sunken stones and sealed chambers. All we have to do is listen. The shadows of the ancient world are deep, but they are not impenetrable. With every passing year, with every new technology, with every new excavation, the shadows recede a little further, and the light of understanding advances a little more. We may never illuminate every corner of the past. We may never answer every question. But the pursuit of knowledge is its own reward, and the story of the ancient world is a story worth telling, a story worth hearing, and a story worth preserving for the generations that will come after us. Because the past is not behind us, it is beneath us, it is around us, it is within us, and it is waiting to be discovered. The earth remembers what we have forgotten. The stones recall what our memories have lost. And somewhere beneath the sands of Giza, beneath the paws of the Sphinx, beneath the waters of the Mediterranean, beneath the sealed door of a temple vault in southern India, the ancient world is still keeping its secrets, patient and eternal, waiting for the day when we are ready to hear what it has to say. That day is coming. Perhaps it has already begun. And when it arrives, when the last chamber is opened, when the last inscription is read, when the last artifact is lifted from the darkness into the light, we will find, as we have always found, that the past is not a foreign country. It is home. It is the place where all of our stories begin, and understanding it is not a luxury or an academic exercise. It is a necessity because without understanding where we came from, we cannot understand where we are, and we cannot hope to navigate where we are going. The ancient world built monuments that have endured for millennia. It created works of art that still move us to tears. It developed technologies that still astonish us. It asked questions that we are still trying to answer. And it left behind a legacy, buried in the earth, submerged in the sea, locked in temple vaults, and inscribed on the walls of tombs that we are only now beginning to comprehend. This legacy is our inheritance. It belongs to all of us. And the work of uncovering it, of understanding it, of preserving it for future generations is one of the noblest endeavors in which human beings can engage. The shadows of the ancient world are deep. But in those shadows, if we look carefully, we can see the outlines of something magnificent, something enduring, something that connects us across the vast expanse of time to the men and women who came before us, who built and dreamed and struggled and loved and died, leaving behind the traces of their existence for us to find. Those traces are precious, they are irreplaceable, and they are worth every effort we can make to recover them, to understand them, and to share them with the world. Because the ancient world is not dead, it is merely waiting, waiting beneath the sand, waiting beneath the sea, waiting behind sealed doors and locked vaults, waiting in the silence of tombs and the stillness of buried cities, waiting for us.